The quill scratched like a dry insect trapped beneath glass, dragging itself across the foolscap until the nib caught on a fibre and splattered a single drop of black onto the margin. Elia's thorn did not blot the stain, allowing the ink to swell into a dark pupil staring back from the white expanse, watching him fail at the only task that mattered, keeping the record clean. Outside the narrow window of the coroner's office, London exhaled a breath of coal smoke and wet dog that pressed against the pane, fogging the view of the churchyard where the dead lay stacked like cordwood in the pauper's trench. "Read that back, Thorne, for the American is waiting." Inspector Halloway stood by the door, his greatcoat dripping a slow rhythm onto the flagstones, each drop marking time in a room that smelled perpetually of vinegar and old sorrow. Halloway did not remove his hat, for the brim cast a shadow over eyes that had seen too many bodies fished from the Thames to care about the grammar of their passing. Thorne cleared his throat, the sound rough as gravel in a tin cup, and lifted the page to read the particulars of Patrick O'Connor, late of the American legation, last seen in the company of one Frederick Manning on the evening of the 8th day of August. The subject had failed to appear for a scheduled engagement at the United States legation on the morning following, causing considerable alarm amongst his superiors regarding the security of dispatched funds. "Security of funds," Halloway muttered, kicking his wet boot against the leg of Thorne's desk with a dull thud. "Always the money, never the man." "He was carrying a bag, sir, since the report specifies a leather valise containing securities." Men vanish for less than a bag of paper, Elia's, vanishing for a look given in the wrong direction, a debt unpaid, or a wife who tires of the sound of their breathing. Halloway pushed off the doorframe and stepped closer, the smell of damp wool and stale tobacco rolling off him in a wave that made Thorne's stomach turn. "Did you get the name of the witness?" the clerk who filed it. "Mr. Devlin waits in the anteroom, and he is agitated." Agitation is the natural state of anyone dealing with the disappearance of property in this city, so tell him we shall look into it and make enquiries. Halloway turned back to the door, hand on the latch, then paused to warn Thorne not to promise a body when they had only ink and the hope that the river had not yet taken its due. Thorne dipped the quill again, the iron gall mixture gleaming oily in the grey light filtering through the grime as he wrote enquiries with a heavy hand, the letters looping tight and angry against the physical resistance of the paper, which seemed to refuse the lie that action would follow words. In the coroner's office, truth was not a moral absolute, but a commodity measured by the weight of the paper and the flow of the ink, and today the ledger was light, dangerously so. He capped the inkwell, the cork making a soft pop that echoed too loudly in the sudden quiet left by Halloway's departure. Devlin sat in the anteroom hunched over his knees, his hands twisting a silk handkerchief into a tight white knot that threatened to snap the fabric. He looked up as Thorne entered, his eyes red-rimmed and darting towards the window as if expecting to see O'Connor walking through the fog, alive and laughing at the fuss. "Mr. Thorne," Devlin said, his voice cracking on the name, "has the inspector given orders? Will you send the constables out tonight?" "The inspector has noted the particulars, Mr. Devlin, and enquiries will be made in the usual course." Thorne kept his voice flat. A professional mask slid into place over the weariness that tugged at his jaw. "You mentioned they were seen together, Manning and O'Connor, but where precisely?" "Bermondsey in Minster Yard." Devlin unclenched the handkerchief, smoothing it over his thigh with trembling fingers while recounting how Frederick Manning's house was the location where they were drinking. O'Connor was in high spirits, talking of a journey to the country, a holiday perhaps, saying Frederick had business there regarding land or a lease, and that he, Patrick, was to accompany him as a witness. "And the lady, Mrs. Manning?" Devlin flinched, a small, sharp movement of the shoulder, admitting she was present and pouring the brandy while seeming very attentive to O'Connor. She was laughing more than was proper, perhaps, but what does that signify when a woman smiles, a man drinks, and the next day he is gone, for it is London, Mr. Thorne, where men disappear into the fog and are never seen again. "Not always," Thorne said, the words escaping before he could check them, suggesting that sometimes they are found beneath the floorboards. Devlin stared at him, the color draining from his face until he looked like parchment stretched too thin over bone, asking if that was a jest meant to comfort the living with dark humor. "Is it?" Thorne stepped closer, noting the way Devlin's breath hitched and the smell of fear souring the air between them. "Tell me, Mr. Devlin, when you saw them last, did you notice anything unusual about the house, any smells or sounds?" "Smells," Devlin frowned, his mind scrabbling back through the memory like a rat in a gutter before recalling a scent that was distinct, like chalk dust or plaster, but sharper. It clung to their clothes, especially hers, and I thought it odd, given the warmth of the evening, for she wore an apron, thick canvas, and the smell seemed to rise from it whenever she moved. Thorne felt a cold prickle start at the base of his neck and crawl up his spine, unrelated to the damp chill of the room, as the word quicklime formed in his mind, unbidden and heavy, bringing with it images of flesh dissolving into slurry. He forced his expression to remain neutral, the clerk's mask slipping back into place, though his hand twitched towards the pocket where he kept his notebook. "Chalk dust," Thorne repeated, writing the words down as if they were gospel. The words sat on the page, black and final, yet the air in the anteroom had thickened until breathing required a conscious effort, as if the oxygen itself had curdled into something heavier, more suspect. Thorne capped his inkwell with a snap that sounded like a bone breaking, the sudden violence of the noise making Devlin jump in his chair, knees knocking together beneath the rough wool of his trousers. "Where does one purchase such chalk, Mr. Devlin?" "Chandler's, I suppose, or builders' merchants near the wharves." Devlin wiped his palms on his thighs, leaving damp patches on the dark fabric that gleamed in the gloom. "Why do you ask? It is merely dust, man, plaster from a renovation perhaps, nothing to hang a suspicion upon when a gentleman has simply gone abroad for his health. Men who go abroad for their health do not leave their securities behind, nor do their associates smell of the stuff used to eat away the dead," Thorne said, rising from his desk and reaching for his coat hook where the heavy beaver cloth hung limp and damp. "I am going to Bermondsey." Now Devlin scrambled to his feet, the chair scraping harshly against the flagstones, a sound that set Thorne's teeth on edge. "Surely you cannot just walk in there, accuse them, demand to see the kitchen flags without a warrant, without the inspector, without anything but a hunch born of a nervous clerk's imagination." "I go to observe, not to accuse, and there is a distinction in law, though perhaps none in the eyes of a frightened man." Thorne pulled the coat on, the weight of it settling on his shoulders like a yoke, and adjusted his collar against the chill that seemed to radiate from the very walls of the office. "Stay here, Mr. Devlin, and if the inspector returns, tell him I have gone to verify the geography of a holiday." He stepped out into the yard where the fog had descended fully, a yellow-gray soup that tasted of coal smoke and river mud, clinging to the skin and soaking into the fabric of his coat within seconds of exposure. The gas lamps along the street were little more than blurred halos in the murk, their lights struggling to penetrate the density of the atmosphere, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to reach for his ankles as he walked. Carriages rumbled past, the iron rims of their wheels clattering on the cobblestones, sending up sprays of filthy water that Thorne dodged with a reflex born of years navigating the slick, treacherous pavement of London. He kept his head down, collar turned up, moving with a purpose that felt increasingly fragile the further he ventured from the relative safety of the official buildings into the labyrinthine streets of the South Bank. Bermondsey lay like a bruise on the city's flank, a district of narrow terraces and enclosed yards where the air hung still and heavy, trapped between the brick walls that leaned towards each other as if conspiring to block out the sky. Minster Yard was a cul-de-sac of modest houses, each identical to the next in its peeling paint and cracked windowpanes, but the Manning residence stood apart, not in structure, but in a terrible, enforced silence that seemed to swallow the ambient noise of the neighborhood. No children played in the gutter, no women gossiped over the low garden walls. Even the stray dogs that usually scavenged the alleys had given this specific patch of ground a wide berth, skirting the edge of the yard with tails tucked and ears flat. Thorne stopped at the gate, his hand hovering over the latch, noting the fresh scrubbing marks on the step, the wood bleached pale where lye had been applied with vigorous, desperate strokes. He knocked, the sound dull and muffled against the solid oak, and waited while the seconds stretched out, ticking away in the silence of the yard, until the door finally opened a crack, secured by a chain that glinted in the dim light. Marie Manning's face appeared in the gap, composed and serene, her hair arranged with a precision that suggested hours of preparation, yet her eyes darted past him to the empty street behind, searching for constables or a crowd. "We are not receiving visitors today, sir," she said, her voice smooth, lacking the tremor of guilt, offering instead a polite refusal that felt rehearsed. "My husband is unwell, and the house is in disorder." "I am not a visitor, Mrs. Manning, but a clerk from the coroner's office, making enquiries regarding Mr. O'Connor." Thorne pressed his foot against the door before she could close it, the wood groaning under the pressure. "It has been suggested he was last seen here, and that he spoke of a journey to the country." Her expression did not change, not a flicker of panic, only a slight tightening around the mouth that might have been annoyance or fear, indistinguishable in the gloom. "Patrick O'Connor is a friend, yes, and he dined with us, but he left early, very early, to catch a coach at the bridge, full of plans for the Kentish lanes and the fresh air." "And the smell, Mrs. Manning?" Thorne leaned in, ignoring her attempt to push the door closed, forcing his way into the narrow hallway where the air was stagnant and thick, with the scent of something chemical, sharp and biting. "The smell of chalk dust that clings to your apron, the same scent Mr. Devlin noted on your clothing the night he vanished." She stepped back, the chain rattling loudly as she fumbled to undo it, her movements suddenly hurried, losing their earlier grace. "I have been cleaning, sir, scrubbing the kitchen flags until my hands are raw, for my husband is particular about cleanliness, and the lime was spilled from a bag we keep for whitewashing the cellar." The lie tumbled out too quickly, lacking the texture of truth, and she turned away from him, walking towards the kitchen with a stiff, jerky gait that betrayed the calm facade she had tried to maintain. Thorne followed, his boots leaving wet prints on the scrubbed floorboards, his eyes fixed on her back, on the heavy canvas apron tied tightly around her waist, the fabric stiff with dried residue. The kitchen was immaculate, unnervingly so, every surface gleaming, the table bare, the chairs pushed in with military precision, yet the air was heavy with that cloying, sweet chemical odor that coated the back of the throat and made the eyes water. He stopped in the center of the room, his gaze dropping to the flags beneath his feet, noticing the subtle difference in color, a patch near the hearth that appeared slightly newer, the grout fresher, the stone less worn than the surrounding tiles. "You have scrubbed hard," he observed, his voice low, watching her as she busied herself with a kettle that sat cold on the range, her hands trembling now despite her efforts to still them. "Hard enough to remove a stain, perhaps, or to hide a seam." "There are no stains here, Mr. Thorne, only the dirt of London that gets into everything, into the cracks, into the soul," she said, turning to face him, her eyes bright with a feverish intensity that was far more terrifying than tears. "We are honest people, my husband and I, and we have nothing to hide beneath our floor but the dust of our daily lives. Dust does not smell of quicklime, Mrs. Manning, and honest people do not scrub their floors at noon with the windows shut." Thorne took a step towards the hearth, his hand reaching for the poker leaning against the wall, the iron cold and heavy in his grip. "I think I should like to see the cellar, and perhaps, if you will allow it, I shall test the firmness of these flags." "You cannot," she whispered, the words barely audible over the ticking of the clock on the mantel, a sound that seemed suddenly loud, rhythmic, counting down to something inevitable. "Frederick will not like it, and he is resting." "Then he shall have to wake," Thorne said, raising the poker, the metal glinting in the dim light as he prepared to strike the stone, to break the silence and the floor alike. The iron descended. A sharp, metallic crack shattered the quiet of the kitchen, the sound echoing off the scrubbed tiles like a pistol shot in a cathedral, and where the poker struck, the grey flagstone did not ring but gave a dull, hollow thud, as if the earth beneath had opened its mouth to swallow the blow. Marie flinched, a violent, involuntary jerk of her shoulder that sent the kettle clattering against the range, the noise harsh and discordant in the small room, yet she did not cry out, nor did she attempt to stop him again, her hands clutching the edge of the table until her knuckles bleached white against the dark wood. "Did you hear that?" Thorne asked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline prickling at the back of his neck, a cold sensation that had nothing to do with the damp chill of the house. Solid stone sings, Mrs. Manning. This sounds like a drum stretched over a pit. It is just a loose tile, she insisted, though her voice lacked the earlier conviction, cracking slightly on the word loose, as if the very admission might bring the roof down upon them. The foundation settles, the ground shifts, London is built on mud and refuse, everything sinks eventually. Perhaps, Thorne conceded, lifting the poker once more, weighing the heavy iron in his hand, feeling the balance of it, the potential for violence that lay dormant in the simple tool of a hearth. But mud does not smell of sweet earth and burnt bones, and loose tiles do not resist the crowbar with such determined silence. He drove the point of the poker into the fresh grout line, leveraging his weight against the handle, the metal groaning as it bit into the mortar, prying upwards with a slow, torturous pressure that made the wood of the handle creak in his grip. Dust puffed up, a fine white cloud that danced in the sliver of light cutting through the shutters, carrying with it that cloying, sickly sweet odor that seemed to coat the tongue and stick to the roof of the mouth, undeniable now, impossible to mask with talk of whitewash or cellar damp. Marie stepped back, her heel catching on the hem of her apron, stumbling slightly before she righted herself, her eyes fixed on the widening gap where the stone tilted, revealing the darkness beneath, a void that seemed to breathe out a cold, stale air that had not seen the sun in weeks. "Stop," she whispered, the command frail, devoid of authority, a plea from a woman who knew the game was already lost, the pieces scattered across the board. "Please, Mr. Thorne, do not make me watch this." "You invited the scrutiny when you scrubbed the floor until your fingers bled," Thorne replied, ignoring her, focusing entirely on the mechanics of the task, the leverage, the angle, the inevitable surrender of the masonry. "Curiosity is a burden I must carry, and you, I fear, have buried something far heavier than dust." The stone shifted again, tilting precariously, and with a final grating scrape, it slipped from its bed, sliding aside to reveal the rough earth beneath, packed hard and dark, disturbed recently, the soil turned over with a haste that left clumps uneven and jagged. Thorne dropped the poker, the clang echoing loudly, and knelt, his knee pressing into the hard flags, leaning close to the opening, his face inches from the exposed grave, the smell hitting him now with the force of a physical blow, rich and rotting, the scent of things that should remain hidden beneath the feet of the living. There just below the surface, a hand protruded, the skin waxy and pale, the fingers curled in a rigid claw that seemed to grasp at the air, seeking purchase on a world that had moved on without it, the flesh marked with the distinct, brutal bruises of a struggle that had ended in silence. Thorne did not recoil, though his stomach churned, a visceral reaction that he forced down, locking it away behind the wall of his professional duty, the need to observe, to record, to let the facts speak where the emotions failed. "Patrick O'Connor," he said softly, the name hanging in the air, a verdict delivered not by a judge, but by the simple, horrific presence of the dead man's hand. "He did not catch the coach, Mrs. Manning. He never left this room." Marie made a sound then, a low, animalistic moan that started in her throat and died before it could become a scream, her body swaying slightly as if the floor beneath her had truly given way, leaving her suspended over the abyss she had helped to dig. She looked at the hole, at the hand, at the man kneeling beside it, her expression shifting from fear to a strange, detached resignation, as if she were watching a play in which she had forgotten her lines. "He was too loud," she murmured, her voice distant, echoing from a place far removed from the kitchen, from the house, from the reality of the moment. "Frederick said he was too loud, that he would ruin everything, that his laughter filled the room until there was no space for anything else, so we had to make him quiet." Thorne stood slowly, his joints stiff, the movement deliberate, giving himself a moment to compose his features, to mask the horror that threatened to break through his composure. "And now he is silent," he said, his tone flat, devoid of judgment, merely stating the fact as he might note the time of day or the weather outside. "But the silence you bought comes at a price you cannot pay, not with lime, not with scrubbing, not with all the lies in London." He walked to the table, picking up his notebook, the leather cover worn and stained with ink, a familiar weight in his hand that grounded him, reminding him of his purpose, his role in this grim theater. With a steady hand, he dipped his pencil into the pot of ink he carried, the nib scratching against the paper as he began to write, the words flowing quickly, capturing the scene, the smell, the sight of the hand, the sound of Marie's confession, each letter a brick in the wall that would eventually seal her fate. August 18th, he wrote, the date stark against the white page. Minster Yard, the body of Patrick O'Connor discovered beneath the kitchen flags of the Manning residence. Cause of death, blunt force shock, followed by burial in quicklime. Confession obtained, voluntary. Marie watched him write, her eyes tracking the movement of the pencil, the scratch of the nib sounding louder than the ticking of the clock, louder than the wind outside, louder than her own heartbeat. Will it hurt? She asked suddenly, her voice small, childlike, stripping away the veneer of the respectable wife to reveal the terrified woman beneath. When they come for us, will it hurt? Thorne paused, the pencil hovering over the paper, a single drop of ink swelling at the tip, threatening to fall and blur the words he had just written. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not the monster the newspapers would paint, but a frail, broken thing caught in a web of her own making, trapped by greed and fear and the terrible, crushing weight of consequence. I cannot say, he answered honestly, his voice gentle now, stripped of the earlier edge. But the waiting, Mrs. Manning, the knowing that the end is coming, hour by hour, minute by minute, that is often the hardest part of all. He closed the book with a snap, the sound final, definitive, marking the end of the investigation and the beginning of the long, slow march towards the gallows. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, thick and yellow, swallowing the light, hiding the street, the neighbors, the world beyond, leaving only the kitchen, the hole in the floor, and the two of them, alive and dead together in the suffocating dark. A heavy pounding on the front door broke the silence, 3 sharp raps that echoed through the hallway, signaling the arrival of the constables Thorne had sent for before he entered the house, the machinery of justice beginning its slow, inexorable turn. Marie did not move to answer it, nor did she look towards the door, her gaze fixed on the open grave at her feet, as if she hoped the earth might open further and take her down into the safety of the dark before the law could lay its hands on her. Let them in, Thorne said, turning towards the hallway, his shadow stretching long across the floor, reaching out to touch the hem of her apron, a dark finger pointing the way to the end. It is time to go. The wood did not yield easily, groaning under the iron prybar, as if the house itself sought to keep its secret buried beneath the scuffed lino and domestic dust. Constable Miller leaned his weight into the handle, veins bulging along his forearm like knotted rope, until the nails screamed and the board lifted just enough to reveal the dark, earthy cavity below. A smell rolled out then, thick and cloying, a sweet rot that tasted of copper and old meat, clinging to the back of the throat with a persistence that no amount of holding one's breath could defeat. Thorne stepped forward, his boots clicking on the remaining flags, the sound sharp and alien in the sudden stillness of the room, while the constables froze, their faces draining of color as the linen-wrapped shape curled in the dirt came into view. It is him, Miller whispered, the words escaping like steam from a cracked kettle, his eyes fixed on the bundle rather than the woman standing by the sink. God help us, it is actually him. Thorne did not speak, his hand already moving to the pocket of his coat where the notebook waited, the leather warm from his body heat, a familiar anchor in the rising tide of revulsion. He pulled it free, flipping past the blank pages to a fresh sheet, the paper crisp and white against the grime of the kitchen, ready to receive the ugly truth that would soon spill from this hole in the floor. The victim lay curled on his side, knees drawn up to his chest as if sleeping, though the dirty linen shroud was stained dark with fluids that had seeped through the weave during the long weeks of concealment. One hand protruded from the wrapping, fingers stiff and claw-like, the skin waxy and gray, pointing accusingly at the ceiling where the kettle began to whistle, a shrill, domestic sound that clashed violently with the scene below. Cover it, Thorne commanded, his voice low but cutting through the haze of shock that had settled over the men. Do not touch the body yet, wait for the surgeon. Miller hesitated, his hand hovering over the grave, before snatching a coarse sack from the coal scuttle and draping it over the exposed limb, the fabric settling like a shroud over the dead man's accusation. Upstairs, floorboards creaked under the weight of shifting feet, the sound of Marie Manning moving in the room above, her presence a ghostly pressure on the ceiling plaster, as if she sought to listen through the wood to the discovery of her handiwork. Thorne looked up, his gaze piercing the ceiling, imagining her face pressed against the floorboards, wondering if she felt the vibration of their voices or the heavy thud of the sack covering her husband's lover. "She knows," Miller said, wiping his hands on his trousers, leaving smears of dirt on the wool. "She must hear us down here." "Let her hear," Thorne replied, uncapping his inkwell, the smell of the gallnut mixture sharp and acidic, fighting a brief war with the stench of decay before losing. Silence is a luxury she forfeited the moment she poured the lime. He dipped the nib, the ink black and viscous, and began to write, the scratch of the pen loud in the quiet kitchen, recording the date, the time, the precise location of the board that had been lifted, the condition of the soil, the nature of the wrapping. Every detail mattered, every comma a brick in the wall that would soon surround the Mannings, for in the coroner's office, truth was not a feeling but a measurement, a thing of weight and ink and unassailable record. The surgeon arrived then, bustling in with his bag of instruments, his coat tails flying, his face flushed from the hurry, bringing with him a gust of cold air from the street that did little to clear the heavy atmosphere of the room. "Step back, gentlemen," the surgeon ordered, dropping to his knees beside the hole, his movements brisk and professional, devoid of the hesitation that had plagued the constables. He peeled back the linen with gloved hands, exposing the skull, the bone shattered and depressed on the left side, a jagged crater where the life had been beaten out of Patrick O'Connor. "Blunt force," the surgeon muttered, probing the wound with a metal instrument, the sound of metal on bone making Thorne's stomach turn over. "Considerable violence. Death would have been near instantaneous, though the burial suggests a desire to hide the act rather than the result." Thorne wrote it down, the words flowing quickly, capturing the clinical detachment of the surgeon, the horror of the wound, the undeniable proof of murder lying in the dirt beneath the tea kettle. From the window above, a shadow moved, the curtain twitching slightly as if stirred by a nervous hand, and Thorne knew without looking that Marie was watching, her face a mask of performative shock for the benefit of any neighbors who might be peering through the gaps in the blinds. She was playing the part of the grieving wife, the horrified hostess, unaware that the audience had already seen the prop blood and knew the script by heart. "Is it him?" a voice called from the hallway, the inspector pushing past the uniformed officers, his hat in hand, his eyes sweeping the room before landing on the hole in the floor. "Thorne, is it O'Connor?" "It is him," Thorne confirmed, not looking up from his notebook, the pen still moving, capturing the inspector's arrival, the tone of his voice, the way his boots stopped just short of the edge of the excavation. "And he has been here since August, by the look of the decomposition." The inspector cursed, a low, guttural sound, and walked to the window, throwing it open to let in the grey London light, which did little to dispel the gloom, but offered a momentary respite from the smell. "She is upstairs?" he asked, turning back to Thorne, his face hard, the lines around his mouth deepened by the sight of the grave. "She is," Thorne said, closing the notebook with a snap that echoed like a pistol shot, "and she is waiting for us to come for her." A heavy pounding on the front door shattered the tension, 3 sharp raps that signaled the arrival of the warrant party, the machinery of justice finally engaging its gears after weeks of idle suspicion. Marie did not move to answer, nor did she call out, her silence from above now absolute, a heavy blanket that smothered the house as the constables moved to obey the knock. Thorne tucked the notebook into his pocket, the weight of it pressing against his ribs, a tangible reminder of the burden he carried, the duty to translate the horrors of the flesh into the clean, orderly language of the law. "Take her," the inspector said, gesturing towards the ceiling, his voice devoid of mercy, "and bring Frederick in from the yard when you find him." As the constables surged towards the stairs, their boots heavy on the wood, Thorne remained in the kitchen, alone with the open grave and the whistling kettle, the steam rising in a thin, ghostly column that vanished into the shadows of the ceiling. He traced the outline of the missing boards with the toe of his boot, feeling the edge of the void, the place where a man had been erased and then found, the cycle of violence completing itself in this small, dirty room. The secret was out, the earth given up its dead, and now the long, slow march towards the gallows would begin, a procession measured not in miles, but in pages of transcript and drops of ink. From the hallway, a new voice cut through the noise of the arrest, a rough, official tone that did not belong to the local constabulary. "Mr. Thorne, a turnkey from Newgate waits without. The Mannings have requested a scribe for their statements before the magistrate." Thorne looked from the hole in the floor to the dark hallway, the path forward suddenly clear, the next stage of the grim theatre awaiting its curtain rise. The kettle's whistle died, strangled by the sudden rush of boots on the stairs, leaving only the damp, earthy breath of the hole to fill the silence. Thorne stepped back, his heel catching on a loose fragment of wood that skittered across the flags with a dry, rattling sound, too loud in the sudden quiet. He watched them go, the constables ascending to drag the woman down from her performative solitude, their heavy tread shaking dust from the ceiling beams that settled like grey snow upon the open grave. Frederick, the inspector, barked, already turning towards the scullery door, his hand resting on the truncheon at his belt, eyes sweeping the shadows where the coal chute yawned black and gaping. Two officers vanished into the rear yard, their shadows stretching long and thin across the wet pavement before disappearing into the gloom of the outhouse, while Thorne remained rooted, his notebook clutched tight against his chest, as if it might leap from his hands and fly into the dirt. The air here was different, thicker, laden with the scent of wet ash and something metallic, the tang of old blood that had soaked into the porous brickwork over weeks of domestic routine. He moved towards the chute, drawn by a morbid gravity, his boots crunching on scattered cinders that littered the floor near the hearth. Here a voice grunted from the darkness of the scullery, muffled by the thick walls, followed by the heavy thud of an object being dropped onto a wooden table, behind the sacks, wrapped in oilcloth. Thorne approached, his pen ready, watching as the officer unfolded the stiff, dark fabric to reveal a pair of men's boots, the leather cracked and caked with mud, but the toes stained a deep, rusted brown that no amount of scrubbing had erased. Blood. It had seeped into the grain, bonding with the hide, a permanent mark of the violence that had taken place in this very room. Beside them lay a bludgeon, a length of ironwood heavy enough to crush a skull, its surface slick with a residue that caught the dull light from the window. "Log it," the inspector commanded, not looking up as he inspected the weapon, turning it over in his gloved hands with a mixture of disgust and professional appreciation. Weight, condition, location, every detail. Thorne, the magistrate will want to know exactly where he hid his tools. Thorne dipped his nib, the inkwell trembling slightly in his grip, and began to write, the scratch of the pen filling the space between the heavy breathing of the officers and the distant murmur of the crowd gathering outside the front gate. One pair men's boots, size 8, stained with coagulated blood on toe and heel. One bludgeon, ironwood, approximate weight 2 pounds, residue consistent with dried blood and soil. The words formed a barrier, a wall of text that separated him from the visceral reality of the objects before him, transforming evidence into data, horror into history. "Frederick is in the yard," an officer called out, dragging a struggling man through the scullery door, his face pale and slick with sweat, his eyes wide and darting like a trapped animal seeking an escape route that did not exist. "Found him trying to climb the wall, had this in his pocket." The officer tossed a small, crumpled packet onto the table beside the boots, the paper unfolding slightly to reveal a handful of quicklime, white and powdery, a stark contrast to the dark stains surrounding it. Frederick Manning said nothing, his chest heaving as he stared at the boots, at the bludgeon, at the hole in the kitchen floor that seemed to pull all the light from the room into its dark belly. He knew then, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow, that the game was over, the lies stripped away to reveal the ugly, brutal truth beneath. "Take him to the station," the inspector ordered, gesturing for the officers to move the prisoner, his voice flat, devoid of triumph or pity, merely stating the next logical step in the procedure. "And secure the house. Nothing leaves this room without my say-so." The room emptied quickly, the boots and bludgeon packed away in evidence bags, the prisoner dragged out into the grey afternoon light, leaving Thorne alone once more with the open grave and the settling dust. The kettle began to whistle again, a low, rising note that seemed absurdly cheerful in the aftermath of the arrest, a domestic sound clinging to the edges of a crime scene. Thorne walked to the hole, kneeling beside the edge where the earth had been disturbed, the soil dark and rich, smelling of decay and secrets long kept. He traced the outline of the missing boards with his finger, feeling the rough splinters where the wood had been pried up, the gap where a man had slept for weeks beneath the feet of his killers. It was a terrible intimacy, this proximity to the dead, the knowledge that life had continued here, tea had been poured, meals eaten, all while a body rotted in the dark just inches below. The silence of the house pressed in on him, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the distant clamor of the crowd outside, eager for a glimpse of the monsters who had done such a thing. A shadow fell across the doorway, blocking the weak light from the hall, and Thorne looked up to see a man in the uniform of a turnkey, his face weathered and grim, holding a cap in his hands. "Mr. Thorne?" the man asked, his voice rough, accustomed to shouting over the din of prison yards. "A message from Newgate. The Mannings have requested a scribe. They wish to make their statements before the magistrate arrives." Thorne closed his notebook, the leather cover cool against his palm, and stood, brushing the dust from his knees, the movement stiff and mechanical. The transition was seamless, the machinery of justice grinding forward without pause, from the discovery of the body to the recording of the confession, each step leading inexorably towards the gallows. "I am ready," he said, his voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil churning in his gut, the weight of the words he would soon capture already pressing upon his mind. The turnkey nodded, stepping aside to allow him passage, his eyes lingering for a moment on the hole in the floor before turning away, as if afraid the dead might reach out and grab him. They walked out into the hall, the front door opening to reveal the grey street, the fog rolling in off the Thames to swallow the houses and the crowd and the sins of the Mannings in its thick, yellow embrace. The carriage waited, a black box on wheels, the horses stamping impatiently on the cobblestones, their breath rising in white plumes that vanished into the mist. "Horsemonger Lane will be busy tonight," the turnkey remarked as they climbed in, the door slamming shut with a finality that echoed in Thorne's bones. "Folks are saying it's the first time in 100 years a husband and wife will hang together, a rare spectacle." Thorne looked out the window as the carriage lurched forward, watching the house recede into the fog, the windows dark and empty, the secret beneath the floorboards now exposed to the world. He thought of Marie, sitting in her cell, composing her lies, and Frederick, shaking in his boots, both of them racing towards the same end, the rope waiting with a patience that dwarfed their own desperation. The wheels rattled over the stones, the rhythm hypnotic, a countdown measured in miles rather than minutes, carrying him towards the next act of the tragedy. He opened his notebook again, the blank page waiting, the ink fresh and black, ready to capture the final, futile words of the condemned. The city blurred past, a smear of grey and brown, the sounds of London fading into the background as he focused on the task ahead, the duty to record the truth, however ugly, however painful. The carriage turned a corner, the wheels dipping into a puddle with a splash that sounded like a gavel striking wood, signaling the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, darker still. "Ready yourself, Mr. Thorne," the turnkey said, his voice low, almost gentle. "They are waiting." Thorne nodded, capping his pen, the click sounding loud in the confined space, a small, sharp noise that marked the point of no return. The fog thickened, wrapping around the carriage like a shroud, hiding the path ahead, leaving only the destination certain, the gallows standing tall and immutable against the sky. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of coal smoke and damp wool, and prepared to listen, to write, to bear witness to the final descent of the Mannings into the history books. The carriage rolled on, the wheels humming a low, steady tune, carrying them towards the prison, towards the cells, towards the truth that waited in the dark. The constables moved through the parlor like a tide of blue wool and brass buttons, displacing the air with the heavy tread of men accustomed to breaking doors rather than knocking. Drawers slid open with a shriek of wood on wood, their contents spilled onto the carpet in a cascade of linens and silverware that clattered against the floorboards. Thorne stood near the fireplace, his notebook open against the rough brick, the pencil scratching as he logged the disruption rather than the items themselves. Chaos had a weight, he noted, pressing down on the ceiling plaster, until the light fixtures swayed gently in the draught created by their passage. "Check the scullery," the inspector commanded, his voice cutting through the din without rising, a flat order that sent two men shuffling towards the back of the house. "And the cellar, leave no bucket unturned." Thorne watched them go, the flame of his candle guttering in the wake of their movement. He followed, not out of curiosity, but because the record required eyes upon the retrieval. The kitchen smelled of damp ash and something sweeter, cloying, that clung to the back of the throat despite the open window. Here the floorboards remained pried open, the earth beneath exposed like a wound that refused to clot, dark soil mingling with the scattered coal dust from the hearth. One of the constables knelt by the coal chute, a narrow recess built into the wall where deliveries were dumped from the street above. He reached into the shadows, his hand disappearing into the black lumpen mass, and withdrew a boot. Leather, heavy, caked in grime. He held it up, turning it slowly so the light caught the dark stains crusting the toe and heel. "Found something, Sergeant," the man said, holding the boot out as if offering a dead bird. Thorne stepped closer, the pencil hovering. He did not touch the object. To touch was to contaminate, to insert himself into the physical evidence rather than merely witnessing it. He noted the size, the wear on the sole, the specific pattern of the stains that looked less like mud and more like dried ink gone wrong. "Log it," the inspector said, leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed over a chest broad with authority, "and see if there's a match." There was. The second boot emerged from the coal dust moments later, tucked behind a sack of anthracite where it had been shoved in haste. Alongside it lay a length of ironwood, thick as a wrist and stained with the same dark varnish as the leather. A bludgeon, crude, effective, silent. Thorne wrote the description, the words forming neatly on the page while his hand remained steady, though his stomach tightened against the ribcage. "Weight?" the inspector asked, nodding at the wood. "Substantial," Thorne replied, not looking up. "Enough to crack a skull if swung with intent." "Intent is for the court," the inspector muttered, pushing off the frame. "We just need the hardware." They packed the items into a coarse sack, the thud of the wood against the leather boots sounding dull and final, like a coffin lid settling. Thorne closed his notebook, the cover snapping shut with a sound that seemed too loud in the sudden lull of activity. The constables were finishing now, their search yielding nothing else of consequence, the house picked clean of secrets save for the one beneath the floor. Marie Manning remained upstairs. He had not seen her since the body was uncovered, though he felt her presence in the way the air shifted when the floorboards creaked above. She was waiting, perhaps, for the noise to cease so she might descend and reclaim the domesticity of the space, or perhaps she knew that the house no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the law now, to the ink and the paper and the men who carried them. The inspector gestured for his men to gather their things, the sack of evidence swinging heavily from his grip as he turned towards the hall. "Secure the premises," he ordered, though there was little left to secure. The doors were broken, the windows open, the floor torn up. "We'll take the prisoner to the station. The coroner will want the body before nightfall." Thorne remained in the kitchen, the only one left standing amidst the debris. The candle had burned low, the wax pooling around the base in hard, white ridges. He looked at the hole in the floor again, the earth dark and undisturbed now that the attention had shifted to the boots and the wood. It was strange, he thought, how a man could be reduced to a shape in the dirt while his killers walked upright, breathing the same air, until the moment the trap opened. Footsteps sounded in the hall, slow and deliberate, not the heavy march of the constables, but the measured tread of a man in uniform leather. Thorne turned, expecting the inspector to have returned for a forgotten item, but the figure in the doorway wore the grey coat of a turnkey from Newgate. He held his cap in both hands, the brim worn smooth from handling, his face lined with the fatigue of a shift that had begun before dawn. "Mr. Thorne?" the man asked, his voice rough, accustomed to shouting over the din of prison yards rather than speaking in a quiet kitchen. "A message from the governor. The Mannings have requested a scribe. They wish to make their statements before the magistrate arrives." Thorne brushed the cold dust from his trousers, the grey powder staining his fingers despite his efforts. The transition was seamless, the machinery of the law grinding forward without pause for breath or reflection, from the discovery of the body to the recording of the confession. Each step led inexorably towards the drop, each signature sealing the fate of those who stood before the ledger. "I am ready," he said, his voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil churning in his gut. The weight of the words he would soon capture pressed upon his mind, heavy as the ironwood in the sack. The turnkey nodded, stepping aside to allow him passage, his eyes lingering for a moment on the hole in the floor before turning away, as if afraid the dead might reach out and grab him. They walked out into the hall, the front door opening to reveal the grey street, the fog rolling in off the Thames to swallow the houses and the crowd and the sins of the Mannings in its thick, yellow embrace. The carriage waited, a black box on wheels, the horses stamping impatiently on the cobblestones, their breath rising in white plumes that vanished into the mist. "Horsemonger Lane will be busy tonight," the turnkey remarked as they climbed in, the door slamming shut with a finality that echoed in Thorne's bones. "Folks are saying it's the first time in 100 years a husband and wife will hang together, a rare spectacle." Thorne looked out the window as the carriage lurched forward, watching the house recede into the fog, the windows dark and empty, the secret beneath the floorboards now exposed to the world. He thought of Marie, sitting in her cell, composing her lies, and Frederick, shaking in his boots, both of them racing towards the same end, the rope waiting with a patience that dwarfed their own desperation. The wheels rattled over the stones, the rhythm hypnotic, a countdown measured in miles rather than minutes, carrying him towards the next act of the tragedy. He opened his notebook again, the blank page waiting, the ink fresh and black, ready to capture the final, futile words of the condemned. The city blurred past, a smear of grey and brown, the sounds of London fading into the background as he focused on the task ahead, the duty to record the truth, however ugly, however painful. The carriage turned a corner, the wheels dipping into a puddle with a splash that sounded like a gavel striking wood, signaling the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, darker still. "Ready yourself, Mr. Thorne," the turnkey said, his voice low, almost gentle. "They are waiting." Thorne nodded, capping his pen, the click sounding loud in the confined space, a small, sharp noise that marked the point of no return. The fog thickened, wrapping around the carriage like a shroud, hiding the path ahead, leaving only the destination certain, the gallows standing tall and immutable against the sky. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of coal smoke and damp wool, and prepared to listen, to write, to bear witness to the final descent of the Mannings into the history books. The carriage rolled on, the wheels humming a low, steady tune, carrying them towards the prison, towards the cells, towards the truth that waited in the dark. The gatehouse swallowed them whole, a moor of damp stone that exhaled a breath hot enough to wilt the collar of Thorne's coat. No longer the crisp chill of the Bermondsey Street, this air carried the weight of 1,000 lungs, a fungal heaviness that clung to the palate like wet wool left to rot in a cellar. The turnkey did not speak as they passed the lodge, merely lifted a lantern whose flame struggled against the gloom, casting long, jerking shadows that danced along the slime-slicked walls. Keys jingled at his belt, a chaotic chime that seemed to mock the silence Thorne wished to cultivate, each metallic clash echoing down the corridor like a small, bright death knell. "Watch your step," the turnkey grunted, his voice flattening against the stone, floors slick with the sweat of the place. Thorne nodded, though the man could not see it in the dark, and tightened his grip on the leather case containing his inkwell and quills. The descent was not merely physical. It felt as though the earth itself were pulling them downward, layer by layer, into a belly where light went to die. They passed cells where men huddled on straw, eyes gleaming in the lantern's sweep, faces gaunt masks of resignation or madness, but the turnkey marched on, boots striking the flagstones with a rhythm that allowed no hesitation. "Frederick first," the turnkey said, stopping before a door reinforced with iron bands. "He's been weeping since supper, like a child denied a sweet." "And the wife?" Thorne asked, his own voice sounding thin, absorbed instantly by the thick atmosphere. "She sits, doesn't say much, just watches." The turnkey shoved the key into the lock, the mechanism grinding with a rust-scraped shriek that made Thorne flinch. "Best get your work done quick. Governor wants the books closed by Vespers." The door swung open, revealing a space so small it seemed to press in on the occupant from all sides. Frederick Manning sat on a low stool, his head buried in his hands, shoulders shaking with a rhythm that suggested performance more than genuine grief. He looked up as Thorne entered, eyes red-rimmed and swollen, the face of a man who had spent too long staring at his own reflection in a puddle of misery. "You've come to take it down, then?" Frederick's voice cracked, a brittle sound that splintered in the damp air. "The whole of it, every foolish word." "I am here to record what you wish to say, Mr. Manning," Thorne replied, setting his case upon the small, scarred table that dominated the cell. He uncapped the inkwell, the smell of iron gall sharp and acidic, cutting through the stench of unwashed bodies and stale bread. "Speak clearly, and I shall miss nothing." Frederick stood, pacing the 3 steps available to him, his hands wringing together as if trying to wash away an invisible stain. "It wasn't meant to end so, you understand. Marie, she has a will of iron, and I am but clay in her hands." He stopped, turning to face Thorne, his expression shifting from sorrow to a desperate, pleading urgency. "Make sure they know I was led astray, that I loved O'Connor as a brother until she turned my heart against him." Thorne dipped his quill, the nib hovering over the foolscap, waiting. "Proceed." "He came for the money," Frederick began, the words tumbling out now faster, less coherent, a river of self-justification that threatened to drown the facts. "Patrick, he was always wanting more, saying he had rights to the house, to Marie, saying things that no husband could bear to hear without blood rising in his cheeks." He paused, wiping his nose on his sleeve, a gesture so vulgar it stripped away the last veneer of gentility. "I struck him first, yes, but it was her idea to dig. Her idea to bring the lime." The quill scratched across the paper, a dry, rasping sound that matched the dryness in Thorne's throat. He wrote quickly, abbreviating where he could, capturing the cadence of Frederick's panic, the way the sentences fractured under the weight of his guilt. Ink bloomed on the page, dark and permanent, fixing the rambling confessions into a legal reality that would soon be read by strangers in a courtroom. Frederick's voice rose and fell, a monotonous drone of blame shifting, while Thorne focused on the curve of each letter, the spacing of each line, anchoring himself in the mechanics of the task to keep the horror at bay. "And then," Thorne prompted, when the prisoner's stream of consciousness faltered into a sobbing silence. "And then we covered him," Frederick whispered, sinking back onto the stool as his energy spent itself. "Beneath the flags, where the cooking fire keeps the ground warm." He never made a sound after the second blow. Thorne finished the sentence, dotting the I with a precise jab. "Is there more?" "No," Frederick said, shaking his head, his eyes drifting to the corner where the shadows pooled thickest. "No more. God forgive me, for the law will not." The turnkey stepped forward, a silent signal that the audience was concluded. Thorne capped his inkwell, the click echoing loudly in the small space, and gathered his papers, blowing gently on the wet script to hasten the drying. He felt a sudden, irrational urge to scrub his hands, as if the ink itself carried the contagion of Frederick's sin, but he restrained himself, tucking the folio under his arm with practiced efficiency. "To the wife," the turnkey said, opening the door. Frederick did not look up as they left, remaining hunched over his knees, a figure of collapsed morality that seemed to shrink with every step Thorne took away from him. The corridor awaited, cold and echoing, the journey to the next cell, a short traverse that felt like crossing a chasm. "She won't cry," the turnkey remarked as they walked, the keys singing their grim song again. "Don't expect any waterworks from her. She's got a spine of steel, that one." Thorne said nothing, his mind already shifting gears, preparing for the contrast he knew was coming. If Frederick was the crumbling clay, Marie would be the iron, and he would need every ounce of his concentration to capture her voice without being cut by its edge. The air grew heavier as they approached her cell, the silence there distinct from the noise of the men's wing, a held breath waiting to be exhaled in words that would seal them both. "Here," the turnkey said, halting before a door identical to the last, yet somehow radiating a different, colder energy. "Mind your tongue, Mr. Thorne. She bites sharper than a stray dog." Thorne nodded, adjusting his grip on his portfolio, and stepped into the threshold where Marie Manning waited, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed on the door as if she had been counting the seconds until his arrival. Marie Manning did not rise. She sat upon the narrow cot, her back straight as a ruler, hands folded in her lap with a stillness that made the turnkey's jangling keys seem obscene. The cell smelled not of the sour sweat that clung to Frederick, but of lavender water, a cloying, artificial sweetness that fought a losing battle against the damp stone and the underlying tang of human waste. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice level, devoid of the tremor that had shaken her husband's frame. "You have taken his nonsense, I suppose." "I have recorded what Mr. Manning wished to say," Thorne replied, stepping fully into the room and allowing the turnkey to close the heavy door behind him. The latch clicked, a final sound that separated them from the corridor's echoing draft. "I am here to record yours, should you wish to make a statement." Marie's eyes, dark and unblinking, tracked his movements as he set his case upon the same scarred table. She did not offer him a stool, nor did she shift to make space. She simply watched, her expression one of mild, detached curiosity, as if he were a tradesman come to measure for a coffin she had already ordered. "There is no need for stumbling grammar in my account," she stated, lifting her chin slightly. "Frederick is a fool who believes pity is a currency. It is not. The law buys only facts." Thorne dipped his quill, the ink welling black and viscous in the nib. "Then let us begin with facts. Your name?" "Marie Manning, and you know the rest. Do not waste my time with the catalogues of birth and parish." She leaned forward, the lavender scent intensifying, mixing with the cold air of the cell. "We speak of Patrick, of what happened when he came to Minster Yard." "Very well," Thorne poised the pen. "What occurred on the evening of the 9th? "Patrick arrived drunk," she said, the words falling precisely, like coins dropped onto a counter. "He demanded money he claimed was owed. He became violent. Frederick attempted to reason with him, but Patrick struck first." Thorne wrote rapidly, the scratch of the nib filling the silence. He noted the cadence, the absolute lack of hesitation in her voice. There was no pleading here, no appeal to a higher mercy, only a stark recitation of events that felt rehearsed, polished until it gleamed. "Strike him where?" Thorne asked, not looking up. "Upon the head. With a blunt instrument, Frederick lost his temper." She paused, her gaze fixing on a point on the wall behind Thorne's head. It was then that the tragedy unfolded as Patrick fell, and he did not rise. "And the disposal?" Thorne pressed, testing the boundary of her composure. "How was the body concealed?" Marie's eyes snapped to his, sharp and assessing. "You seek to paint me as a monster, Mr. Thorne?" she asked, her voice dropping low. "A woman who digs grave in her own kitchen." "I seek only to transcribe your words, Mrs. Manning." "Then write this," she commanded, her voice dropping an octave, becoming harder. "We acted in panic. The lime was purchased to cleanse the house of vermin, not to dissolve a man. When we found him cold, we feared the scandal more than the sin. We lifted him. We broke the flags. It was heavy work, far beyond my strength alone, but necessity lends muscle to the weak." Thorne's hand moved across the page, capturing the fluidity of her justification. She did not flinch at the description of the lifting, the breaking, the hiding. She spoke of moving a corpse, as one might speak of moving a heavy trunk from the attic, devoid of revulsion, focused entirely on the logistics of survival. "Did he speak?" Thorne asked, "before the end?" "He screamed," Marie corrected, a flicker of something resembling satisfaction crossing her face before vanishing. "He screamed for help. That is why we had to be quick. The neighbors are thin-walled and prone to gossip. Silence was the only mercy left to offer him." The quill paused. Thorne looked up, meeting her gaze. In Frederick's cell, the air had been thick with the fog of guilt, a suffocating miasma that made it hard to breathe. Here, the air was clear, icy, and terrifyingly rational. Marie Manning did not see herself as a murderer. She saw herself as a manager of a disastrous situation, tidying up the mess with the same efficiency she applied to her household accounts. "You attribute the planning to yourself," Thorne observed, keeping his tone neutral. "Yet your husband claims the idea of the lime was yours alone." "Frederick claims many things to soothe his cowardice," she replied, a thin smile touching her lips. "Let him have his narrative. It will comfort him on the scaffold. I require no such cushion. I did what was required to protect my home. If that makes me a villain in the eyes of the magistrate, so be it, but do not mistake my honesty for a confession of malice." She leaned back, crossing her arms over her chest, the picture of defiant calm. Is that sufficient, or do you require a diagram of the flags to satisfy your masters? The statement is clear, Thorne said, finishing the line. He blew gently on the wet ink, watching the sheen dull as it began to set. The words sat on the page, permanent and damning, a stark contrast to the fluidity of her delivery. Will you sign it? When the time comes, she said, though not today. Today I merely speak. Let the paper dry while they read it and wonder how a woman could be so cold. Thorne capped the inkwell, the motion feeling sluggish compared to the sharp energy radiating from the woman before him. He gathered his folio, the pages containing the conflicting truths of the Mannings now weighing heavy in his hand. Frederick's tears and Marie's ice both led to the same destination, yet the paths they described were vastly different. You have a remarkable constitution, Mrs. Manning, Thorne remarked, standing. And you have a remarkable appetite for other people's ruin, Mr. Thorne, she countered, her eyes narrowing slightly. Do not think your quill makes you clean. You are part of the machine just as much as the rope. The turnkey rapped on the door, the signal that the allotted time had expired. Marie did not turn her head. She remained seated, her posture unbroken, watching Thorne with an intensity that made him feel as though he were the one being judged, the one whose soul was being weighed in a silent, invisible scale. Good day, Mr. Thorne, she said, dismissing him, and added that Frederick must stop crying, for such behavior does not become a man facing eternity. Thorne nodded, a stiff, jerky motion, and turned to the door. The turnkey unlocked it, the metal grinding against the frame, and stepped aside to let him pass. As Thorne crossed the threshold, he glanced back once. Marie Manning was already looking away, her gaze fixed on the small, high window where a sliver of grey London sky offered no hope, only a reminder of the world she had chosen to leave behind. The corridor stretched out before him, long and dim, the gaslight flickering in the draught. The turnkey fell into step beside him, the keys silent now, as if even the metal respected the gravity of the woman they had just left. They walked in silence towards the gatehouse, the weight of the two confessions pressing against Thorne's side, a physical burden that threatened to bow his shoulders. The assizes are set, the turnkey said suddenly, his voice low, breaking the quiet. Next month, the judge wants them both on the same day. Thorne stopped, his hand tightening on the portfolio. Together. Husband and wife, rare thing that, the crowds will come in their thousands. The turnkey shrugged, a gesture of indifference that spoke volumes about the frequency of such spectacles in his world. Best get those pages dried, Mr. Thorne. You'll be reading them aloud before the winter fog sets in proper. Thorne looked down at the folio, the ink still wet, the words of the Mannings swirling in his mind like smoke. The calendar had locked into place, the gears of justice grinding forward with an inexorable, mechanical certainty. There would be no reprieve, no delay, only the steady march towards the drop at Horsemonger Lane, where the rope would wait, patient and ready, to silence them both forever. He walked faster, eager to reach the light of the gatehouse, to escape the fungal heat of the stone belly, but the chill of Marie's voice followed him, clinging to his coat like the damp of the grave. The gatehouse air tasted of wet wool and the sour dregs of yesterday's porter, a sharp contrast to the fungal rot that clung to the back of Thorne's throat. He laid the folio upon the scarred oak table, the wood grain rising beneath his fingertips like the topography of a barren land, and peeled back the cover to inspect the damage wrought by the damp. The pages from Frederick's cell had already begun to curl at the corners, the iron gall ink bleeding into the fibers where a stray tear or splash of condensation had found purchase, blurring the distinction between the man's sorrow and the paper's absorption. Marie's sheets lay flat, stark and unyielding, the letters sharp as cut glass, refusing to soften even under the weight of the prison's pervasive moisture. Leave them, the turnkey muttered, leaning against the doorframe with a posture that suggested his bones had long ago surrendered to the stone. The fire's out. Smoke won't help now, only make the eyes water and the words smudge. Thorne ignored him, reaching for the candle stump that sat in a pool of its own hardened tallow. He struck a match, the sulphur flare brief and violent, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air before settling into a steady, yellow flame. He held the light low, careful not to let the wax drip onto the confessions, watching as the heat began to drive the dampness from the surface of the paper. It was a futile gesture, perhaps, an attempt to impose order on a process that nature had already decided, but the act of drying felt necessary, a final service he could render before the documents passed into the hands of the clerks who would copy them for the press. The assizes. Next month, Thorne said, not looking up, as if the weight of those words needed no glance to land, for he had already heard him. The judge is eager, the turnkey replied, shifting his weight so the keys at his belt gave a single dull clink. Public mood demands it. They want blood, and they want it served together. A husband and wife, swinging in tandem. It sells papers, Mr. Thorne, more than a solitary hanging ever could. Thorne dipped his quill into the inkwell, not to write, but to test the viscosity of the remaining fluid. It moved sluggishly, thick with cold, much like the city outside these walls. He thought of Marie's voice, cool and precise, dissecting her own morality with the detachment of a surgeon removing a diseased limb. She had spoken of the lime as one might speak of laundry soap, a domestic utility employed to cleanse a stain. Frederick, conversely, had wept over the brutality of the blow, yet claimed the idea was not his, shifting the blame like a child hiding behind a skirt. Two narratives, divergent as parallel lines, yet converging inevitably on the same wooden platform at Horsemonger Lane. They will not hang quietly, Thorne observed, the thought escaping before he could check it. Not her. She'll scream if she chooses, the turnkey said, picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. Or she'll pray, or she'll curse the lot of us, doesn't signify. The drop cares nothing for the volume of the voice. It only measures the weight of the body and the length of the rope. Thorne lifted the page containing Marie's final statement. The ink was dry now, matte and absolute. I did what was required to protect my home. The words seemed to vibrate slightly in the flickering light, accusing him of complicity. He was not merely a recorder, he was the architect of their permanence. Without his transcription, their crimes would remain whispers in the corridors of Bermondsey, lost to the fog and the gossip of neighbors. By committing them to foolscap, he had solidified their guilt, turning fleeting spoken defense into eternal legal fact. He had given them a history, however bloody. The crowd, Thorne said, capping the inkwell with a decisive click. You said thousands. More, the turnkey corrected, pushing himself off the doorframe. They'll come from Kent, from Surrey, from the far reaches of the East End. They'll bring their children. Some will climb the trees along the road to get a better view. They'll treat it as a holiday, a picnic with a spectacle at the end. He paused, his face shadowed by the brim of his cap. Dickens was asking about it yesterday, wanted to know the exact time of the drop, said he intended to write about the morality of it. Did he? Thorne asked, gathering the papers into a neat stack, aligning the edges with meticulous care. I said the public hanging is a sickening sight, a debasement of all who watch. The turnkey spat on the floor, a dark globule landing near Thorne's boot. But he'll be there, they all will, moralizing while they jostle for a position near the rail. It's the great theatre of London, Mr. Thorne, and the Mannings are the lead players. Thorne tucked the folio under his arm, the weight of it pressing against his ribs. He felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to wash his hands, to scrub away the ink that had stained his fingers during the transcription, but he knew the stain was deeper than skin. It was in the record, in the way he had chosen to phrase Frederick's stammering admissions, in the way he had captured Marie's steely defiance without flinching. He had curated their end. The fog is lifting, the turnkey noted, nodding towards the high, barred window where a patch of grey sky was visible, lighter than before. You'll have a clear walk to the office, if you hurry. I am not in a hurry, Thorne said, though he moved towards the door. There is nowhere to go that is not waiting for this to be finished. True enough, the turnkey said, opening the heavy oak door. The hinges groaned, a sound of protest that echoed in the small room. The calendar waits for no man, nor for any clerk. The 13th of November comes round same as any other day, only with more ropes. Thorne stepped out into the corridor, the air cooler here, carrying the scent of rain and distant coal smoke. He walked towards the outer gate, his boots clicking on the flagstones, the rhythm steady and unyielding. Behind him, the turnkey locked the gatehouse door, the key turning with a finality that sealed the space away. The sounds of the prison resumed, the distant shouting, the clatter of buckets, the low murmur of men waiting to die or waiting to kill, a cacophony that swallowed his departure. He pushed through the outer doors and into the yard, where the sky had opened up, releasing a fine, misting rain that coated his coat in a layer of dampness. The street beyond the gates was already stirring, carts rumbling over the cobbles, vendors calling out their wares with voices rough from the morning chill. Life continued, indifferent to the confessions tucked under his arm. He joined the flow of pedestrians, keeping his head down, protecting the folio from the rain with the fold of his coat. The assizes were set. The date was fixed. The machinery, once engaged, could not be halted by remorse or logic or the subtle distinctions of a woman's pride. He walked towards the river, towards the office where the ink would be copied and distributed, towards the next step in the long, slow march towards the gallows. The rope waited. The crowd would gather. And he would stand there, quill in hand, recording the final breaths of a husband and wife who had chosen to meet their end with vastly different eyes, bound together now by the law and the noose, forever etched in the ledger of the state. A carriage splashed through a puddle nearby, spraying mud onto the hem of his trousers. Thorne did not flinch. He merely tightened his grip on the folio and walked on, the wet streets reflecting the grey sky above, a mirror to the somber reality of the city that consumed its own. The air inside the central criminal court hung heavy, a soup of wool dampness and the stale, sweet reek of tobacco that had soaked into the wooden paneling over decades of pleading. Elias Thorne sat perched on a high stool behind the clerk's table, his elbow resting on a ledge stained by the ink of 100 previous condemned men. Quill in hand, he scratched across the foolscap, the nib catching on the grain of the paper whenever his wrist cramped from the unrelenting pace of the proceedings. "Objection, my lord." The barrister for the defense rose, his wig askew, sweat beading on his upper lip, despite the chill draft sweeping under the doors. Thorne did not look up. He merely adjusted the angle of the page, dipping the nib into the well to replenish the flow of iron gall before the previous line dried too pale to read. "Overruled," the judge said. Lord Chief Justice Baron Rolfe sat elevated above the fray, his powdered wig a stark white cloud against the dark oak of the bench. He shifted in his seat, the silk of his robes rustling like dry leaves, and gestured for the prosecution to continue. Thorne wrote "overruled" in a tight, looping script, the ink spreading slightly where the paper had absorbed the humidity of the room. "Exhibit C," the prosecutor announced, his voice booming to reach the back of the gallery where the public squeezed together like salted fish in a barrel. A turnkey stepped forward from the shadows of the well, carrying a bundle wrapped in brown paper. He placed it on the table before the judge and unwrapped the layers with deliberate slowness. The wood beneath was dark, stained with a rust-colored residue that smelled of old copper and damp earth. A bludgeon, heavy enough to crack a skull, light enough to swing in a confined space. A murmur rippled through the gallery, a collective shift of weight that creaked the floorboards beneath the spectators' boots. Thorne paused, his quill hovering above the line, waiting for the noise to subside enough to capture the next question. He watched the crowd instead of the paper for a heartbeat. They leaned forward, necks craned, eyes hungry for the instrument of death, as if the wood itself might bite them. "Is this the weapon found beneath the floorboards at Minster Yard?" the prosecutor asked, turning the club so the light from the high windows caught the gouges in the timber. "It is," the witness replied, a constable with hands clasped behind his back. Thorne's hand moved again, chasing the words, trapping them in black lines that would outlast the breath of everyone in the room. He noted the way the light caught the dust motes dancing above the judge's head, swirling in the heat rising from the bodies below. It was a theater of the macabre, and he was the scribe of the script. "Mrs. Manning," the judge said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a weight that silenced the shuffling feet instantly. "Do you wish to address the court regarding this exhibit?" Marie Manning stood. She wore black, the fabric stark against her pale skin, her bonnet removed to show the arrangement of her hair, which remained neat despite the hours of confinement. She did not look at the bludgeon. She looked at the judge. "It is a piece of wood," she said, her voice clear, cutting through the stale air without trembling. "Any man could own such a thing. To say it is mine is to say the air I breathe is evidence." Frederick Manning, standing beside her in the dock, shifted his weight. He looked at his wife, then at his shoes, his shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. Thorne noted the movement, writing defendant shifts in the margin, a physical tick that might be read later as guilt or merely discomfort. The prosecution claims it was used to strike Patrick O'Connor, the judge said, leaning forward, his eyes narrowing behind the spectacles perched on his nose. Do you deny knowing where it was kept? I deny everything, Marie said, before adding that he possessed a story, my lord, one he wished to be true and therefore made true. Thorne's quills scratched harder, the pressure leaving indentations on the sheet beneath. He knew the truth was not what mattered here, the truth was what survived the transcription. If he wrote it down, it became fact. If he missed a word, it vanished into the humidity of the room, lost to the coughing of the gallery or the rumble of a cart outside. He was the filter, the gatekeeper of history. Mr. Manning, the prosecutor turned his gaze to the husband. Your wife says she knows nothing. Did you act alone? Frederick looked up, his eyes red-rimmed, the whites yellowed by lack of sleep and the smoke of the cell. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at Marie. She stared straight ahead, her profile rigid as carved stone. Frederick's voice cracked. We agreed it was for the best. A gasp went up from the front row. Thorne did not pause. He wrote we agreed, the letters sharp and angular. He felt a coldness settle in his stomach, unrelated to the draft from the door. This was the pivot, the moment the rope tightened around both necks instead of one. Order, the judge banged his gavel, the sound like a pistol shot in the enclosed space. I will have order in this court. The noise died away, leaving only the sound of breathing and the distant clatter of hooves on the cobbles outside as Thorne finished the sentence, putting a full stop with a firm press that nearly tore the paper. He looked up at the judge to find Baron Rolfe watching him. For a second, their eyes met, and the judge gave a barely perceptible nod. It was not mercy, but acknowledgement, for the record was complete and the path was clear. I find the defendants guilty, the judge said, his voice resonating in the sudden stillness, and I sentence you both to death by hanging. The execution is to take place on the 13th of November before the walls of Horsemonger Lane Jail. Frederick slumped against the rail, a puppet with cut strings. Marie did not move. She simply closed her eyes, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm that defied the doom just pronounced. Thorne capped the inkwell. The click of the lid sounded loud in the quiet room. The transcripts, the judge said, gathering his papers into a stack, tapping them against the wood to align the edges. Seal them. Deliver the original to the Home Office. No copies are to leave this building without my express permission. Thorne stood, his legs stiff from the hours of sitting. He gathered his own ledger, the pages still wet with the ink of their condemnation. He held the book against his chest, feeling the weight of it press into his ribs. It was heavier than it looked. And the clerk's copy? Thorne asked, his voice rough from disuse. The judge paused, one hand on the arm of his chair. He looked down at Thorne, his expression unreadable behind the mask of judicial impartiality. You may retain your record, Mr. Thorne, the judge said, turning away towards the door behind the bench. But remember, what is written there is the law, nothing else matters. Thorne nodded, though the judge had already turned his back. He tucked the ledger under his arm, the leather cover cold against his side. The crowd began to stir again, the spell broken, the hunger for spectacle satisfied for another day. They would spill out into the street, talking, drinking, forgetting, but Thorne carried the words with him. He walked towards the exit, stepping over the benches, avoiding the eyes of the Mannings, who were already being led away by the turnkeys. The door opened to the grey afternoon. The fog was waiting. Dust motes dancing above the judge's head, swirling in the heat rising from the bodies below. It was a theatre of the macabre, and he was the scribe of the script. Thorne adjusted his position on the high stool, the wood biting into his thighs after an hour of stillness. His quill hovered over the foolscap, the nib dry until the first word demanded ink. The clerk of arraigns stepped forward, holding a tray draped in green baize. He did not speak, he simply lifted the cloth. A murmur rippled through the gallery, starting at the front and rolling back like a wave hitting shingle. The object rested on the velvet, a length of ironwood, darkened at one end with a crust that caught the light from the high windows. Blood, dried to a russet black, flaking at the edges where the air had touched it. Thorne dipped his pen. The ink flowed thick, pooling before sinking into the fiber of the paper. He wrote Exhibit A, bludgeon. The letters required pressure, his hand forcing the nib to scratch out the reality of the thing. "Recognize this, Mrs. Manning." The prosecutor's voice was flat, devoid of the curiosity that animated the rest of the room. He held the weapon up, gripping it by the clean handle, the stained end pointing towards the dock like an accusation finger. Marie Manning did not flinch. She stood with her hands clasped before her, the knuckles white against the black wool of her dress. She looked at the wood, then at the prosecutor, then back to the wood. Her expression remained fixed, a mask of porcelain calmness that refused to crack under the weight of the gallery's stare. "It is a piece of wood," she said. Her voice carried without effort, reaching the back rows where the pickpockets and street boys leaned over the rails to see the murderess breathe. "Any man could own such a thing. To say it is mine is to say the air I breathe is evidence." Thorne wrote "any man could own." He did not write the tone of her voice, though he noted it in the margin with a shorthand mark, defiance, or perhaps exhaustion. It was difficult to tell the difference when the noose was already being measured. The crowd leaned forward in unison, a collective intake of breath that momentarily silenced the proceedings. Shoulders touched, elbows dug into ribs. They wanted her to tremble. They wanted the stain on the wood to match the stain on her soul. Frederick Manning, standing beside her in the dock, shifted his weight. He looked at his wife, then at his shoes, his shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. Thorne noted the movement, writing defendant shifts in the margin, a physical tick that might be read later as guilt or merely discomfort. The husband's eyes darted to the bludgeon, then away, unable to hold the gaze of the instrument that had ended Patrick O'Connor's life. "The prosecution claims it was used to strike Patrick O'Connor," the judge said, leaning forward, his eyes narrowing behind the spectacles perched on his nose. "Do you deny knowing where it was kept?" "I deny everything," Marie said. "You have a story, my lord. You wish it to be true, so you make it true." Thorne's quills scratched harder, the pressure leaving indentations on the sheet beneath. He knew the truth was not what mattered here. The truth was what survived the transcription. If he wrote it down, it became fact. If he missed a word, it vanished into the humidity of the room, lost to the coughing of the gallery or the rumble of a cart outside. He was the filter, the gatekeeper of history. The ink smelled of gall nuts and vitriol, a sharp tang that mingled with the stale tobacco smoke clinging to the barristers' wigs. The prosecutor turned the bludgeon in his hand, showing the other side to the jury. There was a dent in the wood, a splintered groove where bone might have met grain. A woman in the front row gasped, a sharp sound like tearing fabric. She covered her mouth immediately, but the sound had already joined the record. Thorne did not look up. He watched the nib. A blob of ink formed at the tip, threatening to drop and ruin the line. He wiped it on the pot's rim, a quick, practiced motion. "Mr. Manning," the prosecutor turned his gaze to the husband. "Your wife says she knows nothing. Did you act alone?" Frederick looked up, his eyes red-rimmed, the whites yellowed by lack of sleep and the smoke of the cell. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at Marie. She stared straight ahead, her profile rigid as carved stone. Frederick's voice cracked, the sound fracturing under the weight of his admission. "We agreed. It was," he insisted, "for the best." A gasp went up from the front row, yet Thorne did not pause. He wrote "we agreed," the letters sharp and angular, while a coldness settled in his stomach that had nothing to do with the draft from the door. This was the pivot, the moment the rope tightened around both necks instead of one. The quills scratched on, consuming the silence. "Order," the judge banged his gavel, the sound like a pistol shot in the enclosed space. "I will have order in this court." The noise died away, leaving only the sound of breathing and the distant clatter of hooves on the cobbles outside. Thorne finished the sentence, putting a full stop with a firm press that nearly tore the paper. He looked up at the judge. Baron Rolfe was watching him. For a second their eyes met, and the judge gave a barely perceptible nod. It was not mercy, it was acknowledgement. The record was complete. The path was clear. Thorne capped the inkwell. The click of the lid sounded loud in the quiet room. He gathered his papers, aligning the edges with the side of the desk. The bludgeon remained on the tray, the green baize now pushed aside, the wood exposed to the air and the eyes of the condemned. It looked ordinary. That was the horror of it. A piece of timber from a firewood stack, nothing more, yet it held the weight of a life extinguished. The gallery began to shift again, the spell of the evidence broken by the routine of the court. Men adjusted their collars. Women fanned themselves with folded programs. Thorne wiped his fingers on a rag tucked into his waistcoat. They were stained black. He rubbed harder, but the ink had settled into the creases of his skin. It would take days to fade. "Proceed," the judge said, his voice low. The prosecutor nodded, picking up the next sheet of testimony. Thorne dipped his pen again. The ink was fresh, dark as the blood on the wood. He waited for the next word. The room held its breath. The prosecutor's voice rose, a dry rasp that scraped against the timber of the gallery, demanding specifics where only shadows remained. He spoke of letters, of debts, of a lover buried beneath the kitchen flags, weaving a tapestry so tight there was no room for breath, let alone innocence. Marie did not flinch. She watched him with the detached curiosity of a woman observing a street performer juggling knives, her fingers resting lightly on the rail of the dock, as if she might step down and join the act at any moment. "You orchestrated this," the prosecutor accused, pointing a trembling finger that seemed to accuse the very air around her. "You lured Mr. O'Connor to your home with promises of reconciliation, only to deliver him into the hands of your husband." "I lured no one," Marie replied, her tone flat, devoid of the hysteria the crowd had paid their shillings to witness. "Patrick came because he wished to see me. What happened after he crossed the threshold is a matter for God, not for you to carve up like a joint of beef." Thorne's hand moved automatically, the quill dancing across the page in a frantic scrawl that barely kept pace with her defiance. He captured the cadence, the slight lift at the end of her sentences that turned accusations into questions, making the jury doubt their own certainty. It was a performance, yes, but one of such calculated precision that it felt more real than the stammering confessions of the man beside her. Frederick was weeping now, great heaving sobs that shook his broad shoulders, his face buried in hands that had held the bludgeon. "My lord," the defense counsel interjected, rising from his seat with a rustle of silk that sounded obscenely loud in the hushed room. "My client is being asked to speculate on the intentions of a dead man. We have no evidence of what Mr. O'Connor thought as he walked to Minster Yard." "We have the body," the judge snapped, his patience wearing thin like an old coat elbow. "We have the lime that sought to erase him, and we have the testimony of the husband who claims he acted under instruction." He turned his gaze to Frederick, hard and unyielding. "Is that your position, Mr. Manning, that you were merely the instrument of your wife's will?" Frederick nodded, unable to speak, his chin wet with tears. He looked at Marie, seeking absolution or perhaps just a shared glance of solidarity, but she was staring at the ceiling, tracing the patterns of the plasterwork with eyes that saw nothing in this room. "Then you admit to the striking of the blow?" I struck him," Frederick whispered, the words tumbling out in a rush of shame. "But she told me it had to be done. She said he would ruin us. She said there was no other way." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a sound like wind moving through dry leaves, shifting the weight of guilt from one soul to two. Thorne felt a prickle of sweat on his upper lip, the heat of the gaslights pressing down on them all, cooking the air until it tasted of dust and despair. He wrote, "She said there was no other way," the ink flowing dark and permanent, sealing the fate of the woman who stood so still beside the broken man. It was done. The legal machinery, once engaged, ground forward with an inevitability that no amount of tears or denial could halt. Baron Rolfe leaned back in his high chair, removing his spectacles to polish them with a handkerchief of white linen, a mundane action that somehow made the coming verdict feel even more terrible. He replaced the glasses, adjusted his wig, and looked out at the sea of faces, seeing not individuals but a single entity hungry for conclusion. "The evidence is clear," the judge announced, his voice dropping an octave, resonating in the chest of every man and woman present. "Two persons, bound by marriage and by blood, have conspired to take the life of a guest under their own roof. The manner of the killing, the attempt to conceal the remains, the calculated deception practiced upon the authorities all point to a depravity of mind that shocks the conscience of this court. Marie finally looked at him. Her expression was unreadable, a mask of porcelain that refused to crack, though Thorne saw the slightest tightening of the muscle in her jaw, a flicker of something animal trapped behind the eyes. Therefore, the judge continued, the words landing like hammer blows, I sentence you both to be taken from this place to the prison from which you came, and thence to the place of execution, where you shall be hanged by the neck until you are dead. The gavel fell, a single sharp crack that severed the timeline of their lives. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence, a vacuum where sound refused to travel. Then the room erupted. Shouts, cheers, groans, the scraping of benches as the front rows surged forward, desperate to catch a final glimpse of the condemned before the turnkeys moved in. Thorne did not join the frenzy. He sat very still, his quill hovering over the final line of the transcript, the ink drying on the nib. He watched as a turnkey gripped Frederick's arm, hauling the weeping man to his feet, while another approached Marie with a gentler touch, perhaps recognizing the steel in her spine. She allowed herself to be led away, her head high, stepping over the discarded programs and the trampled mud of the gallery floor as if walking through her own parlor. Frederick stumbled, his legs giving way, dragged along the boards like a sack of grain. The contrast was brutal, a study in the different ways humans meet their end. Thorne closed his ledger. The leather cover felt warm under his palm, heated by the friction of the day's work. He tied the ribbon, securing the pages that now held the official record of their deaths before they had even ceased to breathe. Clark, the judge's voice cut through the din, addressing him directly. Ensure the transcripts are sealed and delivered to the Home Office by Vespers. No copies are to remain in private hands. Thorne stood, bowing slightly, the movement stiff from hours of sitting. As you command, my lord. He gathered his papers, stacking them neatly, feeling the weight of the foolscap in his hands. It was heavier than it should have been, dense with the lives it had just extinguished. Around him, the crowd was spilling into the corridor, a tide of bodies eager to carry the news to the taverns and the street corners, to dissect the details over ale and tobacco. They would speak of Marie's coldness, of Frederick's tears, of the judge's sternness, but they would not know the weight of the ink, the specific pressure required to make the words stick. Thorne stepped out into the corridor, the noise of the court fading behind him as he moved towards the exit. The fog had rolled in again, pressing against the high windows, turning the afternoon light into a sickly yellow bruise. He clutched the ledger to his chest, protecting it from the damp, from the jostling elbows of the spectators, from the world that wanted to tear it apart. The date of execution was set. The calendar had moved forward, relentless and uncaring. He walked out into the gloom, the sound of his own footsteps echoing on the stone, a solitary rhythm against the roar of the city waiting for the next spectacle. The rope was measured. The trap was set. All that remained was the waiting. The smell of Newgate did not change with the seasons, nor did it yield to the scrubbing brushes of the under-turnkeys. It was a permanent, fungal heat that clung to the back of the throat and tasted of wet wool mixed with the sour tang of human respiration. Elias Thorne stepped from the grey afternoon into the stone belly of the prison, his boots clicking sharply on the flagstones before the sound was swallowed by the damp masonry. He carried his satchel tight against his ribs, a reflexive guard against the press of bodies that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. "Mind the step, Mr. Thorne," a voice grumbled from the shadows of the archway. Thorne halted, squinting until the figure resolved into the bulk of Gable, a turnkey whose face bore the map of old smallpox scars. The man stood with his back to the wall, one hand extended, palm up, while the other rested casually on the ring of keys at his belt. A silver sixpence glinted in the guttering light of the gas jet above them, passed from the rough fingers of a visitor to the calloused palm of the keeper. "Coal for the condemned ward," Gable muttered, closing his fist around the coin with a speed that belied his size. "Extra measure keeps the damp off the bones before the end." Thorne said nothing. He stepped around the man, the transaction burning in his peripheral vision, a small corruption amidst the grand machinery of justice. He would not record it in the log. The official ledger demanded ink of a specific weight and paper of a certain grammage, but it had no column for the price of warmth in the final weeks. Truth in this place was a commodity measured by the flow of iron gall upon foolscap, not by the moral accounting of men who sold comfort to the dying. The corridor narrowed, the air growing thicker, heavier, with the sound of weeping that leaked from behind the iron-bound doors. It was not a uniform sorrow, but a cacophony of individual terrors, a ragged choir of men waiting for their own dates with the hangman. Thorne moved past them, his eyes fixed on the door at the far end, the one that led to the exercise yard where the Mannings were permitted their hour of sky. He pushed through the heavy oak door and emerged into the enclosed courtyard. The sky above was a rectangle of bruised purple, choked by the high walls that blocked out the London sprawl. Frederick Manning paced the length of the yard, his coat buttoned wrong, his hands twisting a handkerchief into a tight white knot. Marie stood near the far wall, her back to him, staring up at the sliver of cloud, as if she could bore a hole through the stone with her gaze. "You must speak to them, Marie," Frederick said, his voice cracking on the high note, urging her to tell them she was led and that he had been weak. Marie did not turn, her shoulders remaining rigid while the line of her spine stayed unbroken. "I have spoken my piece, Frederick. The record stands." "The record will hang us." He stopped pacing, lunging towards her, then checking himself when he saw Thorne in the doorway. He lowered his voice to a hiss, a desperate, scrambling sound. "They want repentance. They want to see us broken. If we give them that, surely they might commute a life sentence, Botany Bay." "Look at me." The command was quiet, yet it froze Frederick mid-step. Marie turned then, her face pale as bone china, her eyes dark and devoid of the tears that streamed down her husband's cheeks. She looked at him not with love, nor with hate, but with a terrifying clarity, as if he were already a memory she was trying to discard. "There is no Botany Bay for us," she said, her voice flat, carrying easily across the wet stones. "There is only the drop. Do not make me watch you beg. It serves no purpose." Frederick recoiled as if struck, the handkerchief falling from his twisted fingers to the muddy ground. He stared at her, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air on the dockside. Thorne felt a sudden, sharp contraction in his own chest, a sympathy so acute it felt like physical pain. He shifted his weight, the leather of his boots creaking, and both prisoners turned to look at him. For a moment, the three of them existed in a suspended silence, the fog curling around their ankles like a living thing. Then Marie looked away, returning her gaze to the high wall, dismissing them both. Frederick sank onto the wooden bench, burying his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Thorne retreated into the corridor before the sight could undo him. The walk back to his cubicle felt longer than the journey in, the shadows stretching out to grasp at his coat tails. He sat at the small desk allocated to him, the wood scarred by the knives of previous clerks, and pulled a fresh sheet of paper from his satchel. He dipped his quill, the ink black and viscous, in the pot. He began to write, not the official transcript, but a memorandum intended for no eyes but his own. The scratch of the nib was loud in the quiet room, a rhythmic counterpoint to the distant wailing from the cells. He described the coldness in Marie's voice, the way Frederick's courage had evaporated like steam, the unique horror of a husband and wife bound together not by affection in these final days, but by the shared certainty of the rope. He wrote of the historical weight of it, the first joint execution since 1700, a mechanical novelty that the state seemed eager to unveil. The words piled up, dense and dark, contradicting the official narrative of peaceful reconciliation that the governor preferred. Thorne knew this paper could not enter the ledger. It was dangerous, a deviation from the sanctioned truth. When the page was full, he blew gently on the wet ink, watching it dull from glossy black to matte gray. He folded the paper twice, then again, until it was a small, hard square. Later, he would take it home and hide it beneath the loose floorboard in his study, a secret confession to accompany the public ones. A heavy footfall sounded in the corridor outside, distinct from the shuffling gait of the prisoners. Thorne slid the folded paper into his pocket, his heart giving a single, hard thump against his ribs. The door opened without a knock. A man in the uniform of the sheriff's office stepped in, holding a sealed envelope of thick, cream-colored stock. The wax seal was unbroken, red as fresh blood. "From the sheriff," the man said, placing the envelope on the desk with a deliberate tap. Instructions regarding the apparatus. You are to review the specifications before morning. Thorne looked at the envelope, then up at the messenger. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the fungal heat pressing in from all sides. The apparatus, Thorne asked, his voice sounding thin in the sudden quiet. The double drop, the messenger replied, his face impassive. Engineered specifically for this case, simultaneous release. They wish to ensure there are no complications. The man turned and left, the door clicking shut behind him. Thorne stared at the envelope, the red wax seeming to pulse in the dim light. The mechanical certainty of it chilled him more than the damp ever could. He reached for the letter opener, his hand steady despite the cold knot forming in his stomach. The blade of the letter opener sliced through the cream stock with a sound like tearing skin, revealing the stark, typed instructions within. Thorne read the lines once, then again, the words refusing to settle into any sensible order in his mind. It described a mechanism of traps and levers, a dual apparatus designed to open 2 floors at the exact same fraction of a second, ensuring that neither soul lingered a heartbeat longer than the other. The precision was monstrous. A clockwork mercy, or perhaps a clockwork cruelty, devised by men who had never felt the rope bite into their own necks. He pushed the paper away, the ink still wet on his own private memorandum hidden in his pocket. That scrap of truth felt suddenly heavy, a lead weight against his thigh, while the official specification sheet lay flat and innocent on the scarred wood of the desk. Outside, the prison breathed. It was a living thing, this stone beast, inhaling the despair of hundreds and exhaling a damp, fungal heat that clung to the back of the throat. Somewhere down the corridor, a man began to sing a hymn, his voice cracking on the high notes, only to be drowned out by the rhythmic clanging of a bucket being emptied into the drain. Thorne stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the flagstones. He could not sit. The air in the cubicle had become too thick, too laden with the scent of old sweat and the metallic tang of the iron gall ink. He needed to move, to walk the perimeter of the condemned ward where the shadows stretched long and thin in the gaslight. The turnkeys were busy at this hour, making their rounds with the evening gruel, their keys jingling like silver coins in a beggar's cup. He watched from the doorway of his office as one of them, a burly man with a face like cured leather, paused at a cell door. A hand emerged from the darkness, pale and thin, pressing a coin into the turnkey's palm. The transaction was swift, invisible to anyone not looking for it. The turnkey nodded, pocketed the silver, and unlocked the door a fraction wider than regulation allowed, slipping a small lump of coal into the cell before banging the iron shut again. An extra measure of warmth, bought with money that likely came from a stolen watch or a pawned wedding ring. Thorne looked away. He recorded the confessions, the final words, the legal facts of guilt and innocence, but he did not record the economy of shadows that kept the prisoners sane in their final days. That ledger existed only in the grease on the turnkey's fingers and the slight warmth in the cells of those who could pay. He walked further down the gallery, the gas jets hissing softly above him, casting a yellow glow that made the faces of the passing warders look sallow and sickly. The noise here was a constant, low-level roar, a cacophony of human misery that had its own rhythm. One man sobbed in a steady, hiccuping drone, another prayed aloud, reciting the same verse over and over until the words lost all meaning and became merely a sound, like the wind rattling the bars. But it was the silence from the Manning cells that drew him, a void in the noise that felt heavier than the shouting. He stopped outside the door marked for the female condemned. No sound came from within, no prayer, no weeping, no pacing, just a stillness so profound it seemed to suck the air from the corridor. Thorne leaned closer, pressing his ear against the cold iron, but he heard nothing but the blood rushing in his own ears. He imagined Marie sitting on the edge of her cot, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the wall with those dark, empty eyes. She had refused to beg. She had refused to offer the crowd the spectacle of a broken woman. In her refusal, she had claimed a kind of power, a terrible dignity that frightened him more than Frederick's tears. Moving to the adjacent cell, he found the same oppressive quiet. Frederick was likely asleep, or perhaps pretending to be, hiding from the reality that waited for him in the yard. They were alone together, yet entirely separate, bound by the crime and the sentence, but divided by a chasm of fear and resentment that no amount of shared repentance could bridge. Thorne straightened up, feeling a sudden exhaustion settle into his bones. He was merely a scribe, a vessel for the state's words, yet he felt complicit in the machinery that was grinding them down. The memorandum in his pocket burned against his hip, a secret testament to the truth that would never see the light of day. He turned to go back, his boots making no sound on the straw-strewn floor. The corridor seemed to stretch out before him, endless and suffocating, the gaslight flickering as if struggling against the weight of the stone. As he passed the main gate, a draft of cold air swept in from the outside world, carrying with it the smell of rain and coal smoke and the distant, muddy breath of the Thames. It was a reminder that life continued beyond these walls, that the city slept and woke and ate and drank while two people counted down their final hours. Back in his cubicle, the envelope from the sheriff lay exactly where he had left it, the red wax seal catching the light. He picked it up again, feeling the stiffness of the paper, the formal authority it represented. The double drop, a mechanical novelty. The words danced before his eyes, sterile and clean, hiding the brutal reality of what they meant. Two bodies falling at once, the ropes tightening in perfect unison, a synchronized death designed for the satisfaction of the crowd and the efficiency of the executioner. It was engineering applied to flesh, a calculation of weight and distance that left no room for error or mercy. Thorne sat down, pulling his own quill towards him. He dipped it into the inkwell, the black liquid swirling around the nib. He looked at the blank page before him, the official log waiting to be filled with the dry facts of the day's proceedings. But his hand hovered, unable to make the first mark. The image of the trapdoors opening simultaneously filled his mind, a dark vision of symmetry and finality. He thought of Marie's face, pale and unyielding, and Frederick's trembling hands. He thought of the coin-changing hands in the corridor, the small, futile acts of kindness in a place dedicated to death. With a slow, deliberate movement, he opened the official ledger. The pages were crisp, the lines ruled in perfect red and black. He began to write, his handwriting neat and precise, recording the delivery of the sheriff's instructions, the inspection of the cells, the routine of the evening. He wrote nothing of the silence, nothing of the coin, nothing of the terror that clung to the stones like mold. The truth was too heavy for this book. It belonged beneath the floorboards, in the dark, where it could not be used against them. As he wrote, the hymn from down the corridor faded, replaced by the sound of a key turning in a lock. The night was settling in, bringing with it the long, dark hours before the dawn. Thorne dipped his quill again, the ink flowing smoothly onto the page, capturing the lie that would become history. Outside, the fog pressed against the high windows, blotting out the stars, wrapping the prison in a shroud of grey that hid everything from view. The machinery of justice was oiled and ready, waiting for the morning sun to signal the start of the final act. And Thorne sat in the center of it all, a silent witness to the economy of shadows, writing the words that would seal their fate. The gaslight sputtered, a wet cough in the throat of the iron fixture that sent shadows jumping across the flagstones. Thorne sat motionless in the alcove, the ledger closed upon his knees, his hands resting on the cover as if to keep the book from sliding away into the dark. He had capped his inkwell an hour ago. The scratch of steel against paper felt too loud in the gathering stillness, a violation of the gloom that demanded respect. Instead, he listened. Newgate at night possessed a respiratory system of its own. It inhaled the day's clamor and exhaled a low, guttural moan that vibrated through the soles of his boots and settled in the marrow of his bones. Somewhere to the left, a man was retching, the wet, tearing sound echoing off the iron bars before subsiding into a dry, hacking cough that racked his entire frame. Further down, a woman recited the Lord's Prayer, but she had lost count of the repetitions, stumbling over the words until they became a meaningless chant, a rhythmic battering against the silence. "Forgive us our trespasses." The words hung in the damp air, fragile as spiderwebs, trembling in the draught that slipped beneath the doors. Thorne shifted his weight, the wood of the chair groaning beneath him like a dying animal. He closed his eyes. This was the true work of the clerk, not the transcribing of dates and temperatures, but the bearing of witness to the sound of souls unraveling. He knew the script. Men sobbed until their throats bled, women screamed for mothers long dead. It was the performance of guilt, the necessary prelude to the drop, but the script did not account for the Mannings. He rose from the chair. His boots made no sound on the straw-strewn floor, the straw having been swept clean hours ago by a turnkey seeking to earn his silver. Thorne moved down the gallery, drawn by the absence of noise rather than the presence of it. The air grew colder as he approached the condemned ward, the temperature dropping as if the stones themselves were leaching the heat from the room. He stopped outside the door marked for the female prisoner. He waited 1 minute too. Nothing. No prayer, no weeping, no pacing. The silence was not peaceful, it was heavy, a physical barrier that seemed to push back against his chest. He leaned closer, pressing his ear towards the gap beneath the iron door, but he heard nothing but the blood rushing in his own ears, a thunderous counterpoint to the stillness within. He imagined Marie Manning sitting on the edge of her cot, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the wall with those dark, empty eyes. She had refused to beg. She had refused to offer the crowd the spectacle of a broken woman. In her refusal, she had claimed a kind of power, a terrible dignity that frightened him more than Frederick's tears. Moving to the adjacent cell, he found the same oppressive quiet. Frederick was likely asleep, or perhaps pretending to be, hiding from the reality that waited for him in the yard. They were alone together, yet entirely separate, bound by the crime and the sentence, but divided by a chasm of fear and resentment that no amount of shared repentance could bridge. Thorne straightened up, feeling a sudden exhaustion settle into his bones. He was merely a scribe, a vessel for the state's words, yet he felt complicit in the machinery that was grinding them down. The memorandum in his pocket burned against his hip, a secret testament to the truth that would never see the light of day. He turned to go back, his boots making no sound on the straw-strewn floor. The corridor seemed to stretch out before him, endless and suffocating, the gaslight flickering as if struggling against the weight of the stone. As he passed the main gate, a draft of cold air swept in from the outside world, carrying with it the smell of rain and coal smoke and the distant, muddy breath of the Thames. It was a reminder that life continued beyond these walls, that the city slept and woke and ate and drank while two people counted down their final hours. Back in his cubicle, the envelope from the sheriff lay exactly where he had left it, the red wax seal catching the light. He picked it up again, feeling the stiffness of the paper, the formal authority it represented. The double drop, a mechanical novelty. The words danced before his eyes, sterile and clean, hiding the brutal reality of what they meant. Two bodies falling at once, the ropes tightening in perfect unison, a synchronized death designed for the satisfaction of the crowd and the efficiency of the executioner. It was engineering applied to flesh, a calculation of weight and distance that left no room for error or mercy. Thorne sat down, pulling his own quill towards him. He dipped it into the inkwell, the black liquid swirling around the nib. He looked at the blank page before him, the official log waiting to be filled with the dry facts of the day's proceedings. But his hand hovered, unable to make the first mark. The image of the trapdoors opening simultaneously filled his mind, a dark vision of symmetry and finality. He thought of Marie's face, pale and unyielding, and Frederick's trembling hands. He thought of the coin-changing hands in the corridor, the small, futile acts of kindness in a place dedicated to death. With a slow, deliberate movement, he opened the official ledger. The pages were crisp, the lines ruled in perfect red and black. He began to write, his handwriting neat and precise, recording the delivery of the sheriff's instructions, the inspection of the cells, the routine of the evening. He wrote nothing of the silence, nothing of the coin, nothing of the terror that clung to the stones like mold. The truth was too heavy for this book. It belonged beneath the floorboards, in the dark, where it could not be used against them. As he wrote, the hymn from down the corridor faded, replaced by the sound of a key turning in a lock. The night was settling in, bringing with it the long, dark hours before the dawn. Thorne dipped his quill again, the ink flowing smoothly onto the page, capturing the lie that would become history. Outside, the fog pressed against the high windows, blotting out the stars, wrapping the prison in a shroud of grey that hid everything from view. The machinery of justice was oiled and ready, waiting for the morning sun to signal the start of the final act. And Thorne sat in the center of it all, a silent witness to the economy of shadows, writing the words that would seal their fate. New draft. The gas jets sputtered, wet coughs, in the throat of the iron fixtures that sent shadows jumping across the flagstones. Thorne sat motionless in the alcove, the ledger closed upon his knees, his hands resting on the cover ASIF to keep the book from sliding away into the dark. He had capped his inkwell an hour ago. The scratch of steel against paper felt too loud in the gathering stillness, a violation of the gloom that demanded respect. Instead, he listened. Newgate at night possessed a respiratory system of its own. It inhaled the day's clamor and exhaled a low guttural moan that vibrated through the soles of his boots and settled in the marrow of his bones. Somewhere to the left, a man was retching, the wet tearing sound echoing off the iron bars before subsiding into a dry hacking cough that racked his entire frame. Further down, a woman recited the Lord's Prayer, but she had lost count of the repetitions, stumbling over the words until they became a meaningless chant, a rhythmic battering against the silence. Forgive us our trespasses. The words hung in the damp air, fragile as spiderwebs trembling in the draught that slipped beneath the doors. Thorne shifted his weight, the wood of the chair groaning beneath him like a dying animal. He closed his eyes. This was the true work of the clerk, not the transcribing of dates and temperatures, but the bearing of witness to the sound of souls unraveling. He knew the script. Men sobbed until their throats bled, women screamed. The gas jets sputtered, in the throat of the iron fixtures, sending shadows jumping across the flagstones like startled rats. Thorne sat motionless, the ledger closed upon his knees, his hands resting on the leather cover as if to keep the book from sliding away into the dark. He had capped his inkwell an hour ago, the steel nib now cold and dry, yet the phantom scratch of it against paper felt too loud in the gathering stillness, a violation of the gloom that demanded respect. Instead, he listened. Newgate at night possessed a respiratory system of its own, distinct from the daytime clamor of keys and shouting turnkeys. It inhaled the day's violence and exhaled a low guttural moan that vibrated through the soles of his boots and settled in the marrow of his bones, heavy and wet. Somewhere to the left, a man was retching, the wet tearing sound echoing off the iron bars before subsiding into a dry, hacking cough that racked his entire frame, shaking the bed frame until the chains rattled in sympathy. Further down, a woman recited the Lord's Prayer, but she had lost count of the repetitions, stumbling over the words until they became a meaningless chant, a rhythmic battering against the silence that offered no answer. Forgive us our trespasses. The words hung in the damp air, fragile as spiderwebs trembling in the draught that slipped beneath the doors, carrying the scent of unwashed wool and old fear. Thorne shifted his weight, the wood of the chair groaning beneath him like a dying animal, a sharp protest in the quiet room. He closed his eyes, letting the darkness behind his lids merge with the fog pressing against the high barred windows. This was the true work of the clerk, he realized, not the transcribing of dates and temperatures or the neat columning of final debts, but the bearing of witness to the sound of souls unraveling thread by thread. He knew the script well enough to recite it himself. Men sobbed until their throats bled, women screamed until their voices cracked into silence, and some, like Marie Manning, simply sat and waited with a terrifying, glassy calm that unnerved the turnkeys more than any hysteria. A key turned in the lock 3 cells down, the metal grinding against metal with a shriek that made Thorne flinch, his shoulders hiking up towards his ears. Quiet in there, a voice barked, rough with fatigue and the promise of violence if the order was ignored. Save your breath for morning, or you'll have none left for the drop. The praying stopped instantly, severed as cleanly as a rope cut with a knife, leaving only the sound of the retching man and the low, animal whimper of someone else in the dark. Thorne opened his eyes, staring at the blank wall where a previous prisoner had scratched a calendar into the plaster, the days marked with desperate, jagged lines that ended abruptly halfway through a week. How many had sat here, counting down the hours until the sun breached the fog, only to find that the light brought no warmth, only the clarity of the end. He thought of the envelope from the sheriff, the red wax seal hard and unyielding under his thumb, containing the orders for the double drop. A mechanical novelty, they called it, as if the simultaneous falling of 2 bodies were a triumph of engineering rather than a grotesque spectacle designed to satisfy the bloodlust of the thousands gathering outside the gates. He stood up, his joints stiff from the cold that seeped up from the stone floor, and walked to the small, grimy window. The glass was thick and distorted, turning the outside world into a smear of grey and yellow where the gaslight struggled against the Thames fog. Below in the yard, shapes moved in the gloom, silhouettes of carpenters and officials making their final preparations, their voices muffled by the distance and the heavy air. They were testing the trapdoors again, he knew, dropping sandbags to ensure the mechanism would not fail when the weight of flesh replaced the weight of grain. The thought made his stomach turn, a cold knot of nausea tightening beneath his ribs, but he forced himself to watch, to memorize the scene for the private journal he kept hidden beneath his floorboards at home. "You're still here, then?" Thorne turned sharply, his heart hammering against his ribs, to find Inspector Halloway standing in the doorway, his greatcoat damp with mist, the brim of his hat dripping water onto the flagstones. The inspector's face was drawn, the lines around his mouth deepened by the exhaustion of a week spent hunting down witnesses and suppressing rumors that threatened to spiral out of control. "The record must be complete," Thorne said, his voice sounding thin and reedy in the large room, lacking the authority he wished it possessed. "Until the last moment, the ledger remains open." Halloway stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him, shutting out the corridor's moans and leaving them in a pocket of intimate silence. "There is no record that can capture what happens tomorrow, Thorne, not really. The ink dries, the paper yellows, but the smell of it, the sheer weight of those two bodies swinging together, that stays in the nose long after the facts are forgotten." He walked over to the table, running a gloved finger along the edge of the ledger, leaving a faint smear of dirt on the pristine cover. "Dickens is out there, you know, in the crowd, sketching the faces of the mob like a vulture circling a carcass. He says it's a heathen assembly, a disgrace to civilization, yet he cannot look away, and neither can any of us." "Then let him write his account," Thorne replied, feeling a sudden, sharp defensiveness rise in his chest, a need to protect the sanctity of his own observation from the novelist's dramatic flair. "My duty is to the truth of the procedure, not the morality of the spectacle. The law demands a record, however imperfect." "The law demands a corpse," Halloway corrected, his voice dropping to a murmur that barely rose above the sound of the retching man in the next cell. "And tomorrow it will have two. Do not mistake the paperwork for the justice, Elias. The paper is just the shroud we wrap it in to make it palatable." He turned to leave, pausing with his hand on the latch, looking back at Thorne with an expression of profound weariness. "Get some sleep if you can. You'll need your hands steady for the signing." The door clicked shut, leaving Thorne alone once more with the breathing of the prison and the ghost of the inspector's words hanging in the air. He looked down at his hands, seeing the faint tremor in his fingers that he had tried so hard to suppress, the physical manifestation of the dread that had taken root in his gut. Sleep was impossible. The idea of lying down in a bed, of closing his eyes while the world moved towards its brutal conclusion, felt like a betrayal of the dead who were already counting their final minutes. He sat back down, opening the ledger once more, but he did not dip his quill. Instead, he took a fresh sheet of foolscap from his private stack, the paper rougher and cheaper than the official stock, and placed it over the formal log. The gas jet flickered, casting a long, wavering shadow across the page, and in that uncertain light, he began to write not the facts of the procedure, but the sound of the night, the texture of the fear, the human reality that the state sought to erase with the drop of a trapdoor. The pen scratched against the paper, a frantic, desperate sound, as if he could outrun the morning by filling the page with enough truth to outweigh the lie of the official record. Outside, the fog thickened, blotting out the stars and wrapping the prison in a shroud of grey that hid everything from view, while inside, the clock on the mantel ticked away the seconds, each one a step closer to the hour when the machinery of justice would grind forward, indifferent to the words written in the dark. The church bell in the distance began to toll, a slow, mournful sound that vibrated through the stone walls, marking the arrival of midnight and the beginning of the final 12 hours. Thorne stopped writing, the ink pooling at the end of a word, a dark stain spreading like a bruise on the paper. He listened to the bell, counting the strokes until the sound faded into the silence, leaving only the waiting and the dark and the terrible, inevitable approach of the dawn. It was time to go to them. He stepped into the corridor. The air bit at his exposed skin, sharp with the scent of damp wool and unwashed bodies, a stark contrast to the stale warmth of his office. Boots clicked on the flagstones as he moved towards the outer gate, the sound echoing like a countdown in the hollow space. Newgate slept fitfully, groaning in its sleep, but Thorne walked with purpose, pulling his greatcoat tight against the November chill that seeped through the wool and settled in his bones. Outside, the street was a river of grey. Fog clung to the cobbles, swirling around the wheels of late-night carts and muffling the clip-clop of horses until the city felt submerged, drowned beneath a blanket of soot and moisture. He turned south, crossing the Thames via London Bridge, where the water below moved black and silent, hiding the refuse and the drowned things that drifted with the tide. His breath plumed before him, white ghosts dissipating into the gloom as he walked, each step taking him closer to the place where the state intended to stop two hearts beating in unison. Horsemonger Lane Jail loomed ahead, a block of darkness against the slightly lighter sky, its walls high and forbidding, topped with iron spikes that caught the faint glow of the gas lamps. A turnkey waited at the side entrance, a lantern in hand, the flame dancing behind cracked glass. He recognized Thorne, nodding once without speech, and unlocked the door with a heavy clatter of keys that sounded too loud in the quiet night. "You're early, Mr. Thorne," the man said, his voice rough from tobacco and disuse. "They're still up on the platform, testing the drop." "I need to see the mechanism," Thorne replied, stepping past him into the yard, "before the light changes." "Suit yourself, just don't get in the way of the bags." Thorne climbed the wooden stairs to the scaffold, the timber creaking under his weight, resonating with a hollow sound that suggested emptiness waiting to be filled. At the top, the open sky offered no relief, only a deeper cold that numbed his fingers and made his eyes water. Two carpenters stood near the trapdoors, their breath visible in short puffs, handling large sacks filled with sand that swung heavily from their hands. They were rough men, dressed in smocks stained with sawdust and oil, their movements practiced and devoid of sentiment. "Drop it," one of them called out. The other released the sack. It fell through the opening with a heavy thud, striking the ground below with a dull impact that vibrated up through the soles of Thorne's boots. The sound was wrong, too solid, too final. "She held?" the first carpenter asked, leaning over the edge to inspect the hinges. "Eyes smooth as butter." Thorne watched them haul the bag back up, the hemp rope groaning under the strain, the fibers twisting tight before relaxing. He moved closer, drawn by a morbid curiosity he could not suppress, looking down into the pit where the bag had landed. Darkness stared back, a mouth waiting to swallow flesh instead of grain. "You're the clerk," the second carpenter said, noticing Thorne's proximity. He wiped his hands on his trousers, leaving streaks of dirt on the fabric. "Here to count the knots." "I'm here to witness the procedure," Thorne said, forcing his voice to remain steady despite the tightness in his throat. "Ensure the record matches the event." "Record won't feel the jerk," the man muttered, picking up the sack again. "Wood doesn't care if it's sand or a soul, it just opens." He dropped the second bag. Another thud, another vibration, another step towards the morning. Thorne flinched, a small, involuntary movement that he hoped the men did not see in the dim light. They worked with efficient brutality, treating the scaffold like any other construction site, indifferent to the purpose it served. To them, it was joinery. To Thorne, it was an altar built for sacrifice. "Will it hold two?" Thorne asked, the question slipping out before he could check it. The carpenter paused, holding the rope midway, and looked at Thorne before shifting his gaze to the trapdoors and back again. "It's built for two," he said. "We tested it with 4 bags yesterday, so it won't fail tomorrow." "Failure implies a choice," Thorne said softly. "This is merely physics. Call it what you like, just don't stand on the edge when the time comes." The man turned back to his work, dismissing the clerk with a shrug of his broad shoulders. "We are done here. You can have the platform to yourself if you want to say a prayer." They descended the stairs, leaving Thorne alone with the trapdoors and the cold wind that whipped through the gaps in the wood. He walked to the center, standing exactly where Marie Manning would stand, feeling the rough wood beneath his feet. The planks were new, unweathered, lacking the stains of previous executions, because this structure had been built specifically for this double hanging, a unique engineering challenge for a unique crime. He placed his hand on the beam, the wood rough, and splintered against his palm, smelling of pine resin and oil. Below in the yard, shadows moved, more turnkeys arriving, the preliminary gathering of the officials who would oversee the end of the line. Thorne withdrew a small notebook from his coat pocket, the leather cover worn smooth from handling, and opened it to a blank page. He did not write. He simply held the pen over the paper, watching the ink well up at the nib, threatening to spill. The test had been successful. The mechanism worked. The state would have its corpses. He closed the book and slipped it back into his pocket, the leather creaking in the silence. There was nothing more to document here. The physics were sound, the wood was strong, and the rope was ready. The human element remained the variable, the unknown quantity that no sandbag could simulate. He turned towards the stairs, his boots scuffing against the timber, and began the descent back to the ground level. Outside the jail walls, a noise was building. A low murmur, like the sea before a storm, rising from the streets beyond the iron gates. People were gathering already, despite the hour, drawn by the spectacle like moths to a flame that would burn them only with curiosity. Thorne walked through the main gate, the turnkey locking it behind him with a heavy clang that separated the inside from the outside, the condemned from the free. The street was filling up. Figures emerged from the fog, huddled in groups, sharing bottles and whispers, their faces pale and indistinct in the gloom. They waited for the dawn, for the drop, for the moment when death became public property. Thorne pushed through the crowd, keeping his head down, avoiding eye contact with the eager spectators who jostled for position near the front. He needed air, space, a moment to breathe before the roar began. Near the corner, a man stood apart from the others, leaning against a brick wall with a notebook in his hand, sketching the scene with quick, sharp strokes of a pencil. He wore a dark coat and a hat pulled low, his expression one of intense, disgusted fascination. Thorne recognized him from the illustrations in the newspapers, the sharp features and the piercing gaze that seemed to catalogue every flaw in the assembly. "Dickens!" The writer looked up as Thorne approached, catching his eye for a brief second. He did not smile. He merely nodded, a shared acknowledgement of the ugliness they were both witnessing before turning back to his page. Thorne stopped beside him, following his gaze to the crowd, where a woman was laughing loudly, a harsh sound that cut through the damp air. "They come for the blood," Dickens said, his voice low, barely audible over the growing din. "Not the justice." "They come for the end," Thorne corrected, though he felt the truth of the writer's words settle in his stomach. "Anything that stops the waiting." "There's no end to this," Dickens muttered, scratching harder at the paper. "Only more beginnings." Thorne looked at the sketch, seeing the crowd rendered as grotesque shapes, distorted by the artist's disdain. It was accurate. It was horrifying. It was the truth of the moment captured in graphite. He turned away, unable to look any longer at the caricature of the mob that surrounded them, and focused on the jail wall rising above them, blank and indifferent to the humanity swirling at its base. The bell tolled again, 12:30. The night was half gone, and the sun would bring the rope. Thorne buttoned his coat against the wind, feeling the cold penetrate deeper now, reaching the marrow. He had witnessed the test. He had seen the crowd. Now he had to wait for the act itself. He moved away from the wall, finding a spot near the railing where he could see the scaffold without being crushed by the press of bodies. His hand rested on the cold iron, the metal biting into his skin, grounding him in the physical reality of the scene. The murmur of the crowd grew louder, a collective intake of breath that promised a roar when the trap fell. Thorne closed his eyes for a second, listening to the sound of the living waiting for the dead. He opened them to a wall of coats and bonnets pressing closer, the gap he had occupied swallowed by the surge of late arrivals. A man beside him reeked of gin and roasted chestnuts, the sweet smoke clinging to the damp wool of his scarf. Someone shouted about a better view near the gate, shoving an elbow into Thorne's ribs, but the clerk did not shift. He stood anchored by the railing, the iron cold enough to burn the palm if he gripped it too tight. "5 bob for a spot on the wall," a voice cried out from the shadows. "See the drop clear as day." "Robber," another muttered. "They ain't even dead yet." Thorne watched a boy no older than 10 perched on a man's shoulders, legs dangling over the father's collar, eyes wide and unblinking towards the scaffold. The child held a half-eaten apple, juice running down his chin, sticky in the frost. He did not look afraid. He looked hungry for the spectacle, same as the rest. This was the heathen assembly Dickens had sketched, a congregation worshipping at the altar of the trapdoor, paying their tithes in copper and curiosity. Thorne's hand drifted to his pocket, fingers brushing the notebook inside. The paper waited for facts, dates, the official time of death, yet here the truth was messy, organic, smelling of stale ale and unwashed bodies. A link boy weaved through the press, holding a flaming torch aloft, the resin sputtering as moisture hit the flame. He offered light for a penny, casting long, dancing shadows that made the crowd look like a single heaving beast. Thorne stepped back to avoid the drip of hot wax, his boot finding the edge of the curb. The mud of Borough was deep here, churned by hundreds of feet into a slurry that sucked at the leather. He lifted his foot, wiping the sole against the railing, leaving a smear of brown on the painted iron. "You staying till morning?" Thorne turned. Dickens had not moved from the brick wall, though the sketchbook was closed now, tucked inside his coat. The writer held a cigar, the ember glowing bright orange in the gloom, smoke curling up to join the fog. "I have no purpose here once the sun rises," Thorne said. "The record begins after." "The record begins now," Dickens corrected, tapping ash onto the pavement. "They are part of the story. The ones who watch are as guilty as the ones who pull the lever. Spectators are not convicted felons." "No, but they feed the machine." Dickens took a long drag, the light illuminating the deep lines around his mouth. "I shall stay. Someone must bear witness to the witnesses." Thorne nodded, a brief dip of the chin, and turned away. He could not argue the point, not when the crowd surged forward with a sudden roar as a window opened above the jail wall. A candle flickered in the darkness, a signal that the officials were taking their places. The noise swelled, a physical pressure against the eardrums, greedy and impatient. Thorne felt the vibration of it in his chest, a low thrum that had nothing to do with the earth and everything to do with bloodlust. He needed distance. The air here was too thick, too consumed by the anticipation of violence. He pushed against the flow, moving backward, upstream against the tide of bodies. A woman in a shawl cursed him as he brushed her arm, her face flushed with drink and excitement. He did not apologize. He kept moving, shoulders hunched, focusing on the rhythm of his own breathing to drown out the clamor. The gas lamps on the corner offered a weaker light, flickering yellow pools on the wet stones. He reached the edge of the crowd and stepped into the relative quiet of the side street, the roar diminishing to a dull hum behind him. His breath plumed in front of him, white and transient. The cold had settled into his bones during the vigil, a deep ache in the joints that promised stiffness by dawn. He walked briskly, the sound of his own footsteps sharp on the pavement, a solitary cadence against the distant murmur of the mob. A hackney carriage rattled past, the wheels splashing through a puddle, the driver huddled under a heavy cloak, reins loose in his hands. He did not look at Thorne. Everyone in London tonight was bound for the same destination, or fleeing from it. Thorne turned towards the Thames, the river invisible in the mist, but present in the smell, a heavy scent of mud and salt and decay that permeated the south bank. He walked along the railing, the water lapping silently against the pilings below. Here, the city felt different. The urgency of the execution faded, replaced by the slow, indifferent flow of the tide. He stopped and leaned over the parapet, looking down into the black water. It carried the refuse of the metropolis out to sea, washing the streets clean while the jail filled with death. A paper floated past, caught on a submerged post. It spun in the eddy, the ink running as the water soaked into the fiber. Thorne watched it disintegrate, the words dissolving into pulp. His own notes would not suffer the same fate. They would be bound in leather, stored in a dry office, catalogued and indexed. They would outlast the wood of the scaffold, the rope, the bodies beneath the floor. The thought offered no comfort. It merely confirmed the weight of the task waiting for him. He straightened his coat, pulling the collar up against the wind. The church bell tolled again, the sound muffled by the fog, counting the hours until the drop. 1 o'clock. 7 hours remained. He could return to the office, prepare the ink, arrange the foolscap. He could wait for the report to be brought to him, sparing himself the final spectacle. That was the prudent course, the professional course. Yet his feet carried him towards the bridge, towards the north bank and the city. He walked without haste, the rhythm of the stride calming the frayed edges of his nerves. The streets were emptier here, the respectable citizens asleep in their beds, unaware of the gathering storm in Southwark. A watchman called the hour from a corner, his voice echoing off the blank walls of a warehouse. Thorne acknowledged him with a nod, though the man did not see it. He reached the office building on Minster Yard, the brick dark and uninviting. The key turned in the lock with a heavy scrape, the sound echoing in the empty hallway. He climbed the stairs, the wood groaning under his weight, each step a measured effort. Inside his room, the fire had died down to embers, casting a faint red glow across the desk. He did not relight it. The darkness suited the mood. Thorne sat in the chair, the leather cold through his trousers. He placed the notebook on the desk, smoothing the cover with a flat hand. The pen lay beside it, the nib dry. He did not pick it up. Instead, he watched the embers fade, the red turning to grey, the heat dissipating into the chill air. Outside, the city held its breath. The fog pressed against the windowpane, obscuring the world beyond the glass. He waited for the sun to rise on a day that history had already written, rendering his further notes merely a formality for the state's ledger. The silence of the room was absolute, a stark contrast to the roar still echoing in his memory. He closed his hand over the pen, the metal cool against his skin. The inkwell stood ready, black and viscous. He uncorked it, the smell of iron gall sharp in the stillness. There was work to be done before the bell tolled 8. He dipped the nib, the ink clinging to the steel, and hovered over the page. The first word would anchor the rest. He pressed down. The wood beneath his boots vibrated, not from wind, but from the mass of people packed into the yard below, a low-frequency thrum that traveled up through the posts and into the soles of his shoes. Thorne shifted his weight, the plank groaning in protest, and pulled his collar tighter against the damp. Dawn had broken not with light, but with a lifting of the blackness to a bruised purple, enough to reveal the ropes hanging stiff and white against the grey sky. 2 nooses. Swinging gently, though there was no wind. He stood to the side, notebook open in his left hand, the pen poised but unused. Ink would freeze if he waited too long. The chaplain, a small man swallowed by his own robes, stood between the prisoners, his voice cracking as he recited the commendatory prayer. The words were lost to the roar rising from the street, a beast waking up to feed. Thorne leaned forward, straining to catch the syllables, but the mob drowned them out. "Speak up, man," Frederick Manning muttered. His voice was thin, raspy from the cold and the night's lack of sleep. He stood with his hands pinioned before him, the black coat buttoned wrong at the collar. "I cannot hear the Lord in this racket." The chaplain paused, looking at the turnkey standing by the lever. The turnkey shook his head, impatient. Time was a commodity spent, not saved. Marie Manning stood to her husband's left, her face veiled in black crape that obscured everything but the set of her jaw. She did not tremble. Her hands were clasped around a prayer book, the leather worn smooth by thumbing. "The Lord bless thee and keep thee," the chaplain tried again, louder this time, forcing the words into the gap between the prisoners. "The Lord make his face to shine upon thee." Marie lowered the book. "He does not shine here, Mr. Davis," she said, noting that only the gaslight shines, and that is dim. Her voice carried. It cut through the noise below, clear and sharp as broken glass. A ripple went through the front rows of the crowd, those close enough to hear the defiance. Thorne wrote nothing. He watched her hand tighten on the book, the knuckles white against the dark leather. She was not praying for mercy, she was stating a fact. Thorne stepped closer, his shoulder brushing the rough wool of Frederick's sleeve. "Mrs. Manning," he said, keeping his voice low, "do you wish to add to your confession before the end?" She turned her head slowly. The veil moved with her. "I have signed what I signed, Mr. Thorne. The ink is dry. Why would I wet it again with breath I do not have?" "For the record," Thorne said, "for the truth." "Truth is what you write," she replied, "not what I say." Frederick shifted, the chains at his wrists clinking against the buttons of his coat. "Marie," he whispered, "do not provoke them. Let us have the prayer. Let us go cleanly." "Cleanly," she repeated, the word turning sour in the cold air. "There is nothing clean about this wood. It smells of tar and old blood." Thorne looked down at the trapdoors, which were painted yellow, the color already peeling at the edges where the moisture had got in. Beneath them lay the drop, calculated to the inch based on weight and stature. He had seen the calculations and checked the weights himself. While Frederick would fall further, Marie was lighter, so her drop was shorter. The mechanics were precise, ensuring the outcome was certain. A turnkey bumped against Thorne's hip, shoving past to check the pin on the lever. "Back, sir, keep to the rail." Thorne stepped back, his heel catching on an uneven board, and though he righted himself by gripping the railing, the wood felt slick with condensation. Below, the crowd surged again, a wave of hats and upturned faces that wanted the drop, wanted the jerk, and wanted the proof of death. "Are you ready?" the chief turnkey asked. He looked at neither prisoner, but at the chaplain. The chaplain nodded, stepping away from the couple. He moved to the edge of the platform, leaving them alone with the ropes. Frederick began to weep, a dry, hitching sound that shook his shoulders. Marie reached out, her gloved hand finding his arm. She held it for a second, then let it drop. "Stand straight, Frederick," she said. "Do not struggle. It is worse if you struggle." "I cannot help it," he said. His legs were shaking. Thorne could see the tremor in the trousers, the way the fabric rippled over the muscle. "The air is so thin up here." "Breathe," she commanded. "Think of the room, think of the kitchen." Thorne's pen hovered over the paper. Think of the kitchen, where the body lay, where the lime had been spread. He wrote the words down, quick and sharp. Think of the kitchen. It was a confession in itself, an admission of memory that bound her to the crime even as she denied the guilt. The chief turnkey raised his hand. The crowd below sensed the motion. The roar dipped, falling away into a hush that was heavier than the noise. Thousands of people holding their lungs still. Thorne could hear the sound of his own breathing, ragged in his throat. He could hear the creak of the ropes as the wind caught them, just a fraction. "God have mercy," Frederick whispered. "God has done what he would," Marie said. The turnkey's hand dropped. Thorne did not look at the faces. He looked at the trapdoors. He watched the yellow paint. He watched the line where the wood met the frame. He waited for the mechanism to engage, for the clockwork of the law to strike the hour. The lever clanked. The iron pin withdrew. The floor vanished. Frederick went first, the weight of his body pulling the bolt, but Marie followed in the same breath, the two drops synchronized by the engineering of the beam. They fell out of sight, the rope snapping taut with a sound like a whip crack. Thorne's hand jerked, the pen scratching a long black line across the foolscap. He did not lift it. He watched the rope sway, the fibers twisting under the load. Sentence 1. Below, the silence held for a heartbeat, 2 heartbeats, then broke into a shout. "This is already a bit long breathing. I can keep it mostly intact or slightly adjust for flow. Let's keep it as the opening breathing sentence." Draft. Below, the silence held for a heartbeat, 2 heartbeats, then broke into a shout. Sentence 2 and 3. Original. Thorne looked at his notebook. The ink was spreading into the fiber, a blot where the pen had stopped. The turnkey moved to the edge, looking down into the pit. He nodded to the governor. Thorne closed the book. The wood beneath his feet was still vibrating, but the source had changed. It was no longer the crowd. It was the wind in the ropes, swinging empty in the grey light. He turned away from the rail, the book heavy in his hand, and walked towards the stairs. The performance was over. The ledger remained. His boot found the first tread, the wood groaning under his weight with a complaint of timber that had borne too many boots, too much blood, too much finality. He descended 1 step, then another, the book clamped against his ribs like a broken wing, while the air down here grew thicker than on the platform, heavy with the breath of thousands waiting for the signal that the deed was done. He should have kept walking, for the entry was made, the time noted, and the law had taken its due. Yet his feet stalled on the 3rd stair, rooted by a sudden shift in the atmosphere below. The hush broke. It did not fade gently. The restraint of the mob shattered like dropped porcelain, replaced by a roar that surged against the gallows legs, a physical pressure that pushed the dust from the cracks in the floorboards. They wanted confirmation. A shout went up from the front rank, taken up by the middle, then the back, until the sound was a single organism devouring the morning. Thorne turned back towards the platform, unable to sever the connection just yet. He needed to see the end of the mechanism. Above him, the hangman moved. William Calcraft stepped forward with the knife. He handled the blade with the casual familiarity of a butcher trimming fat from a joint, devoid of reverence or malice. The rope strained under the weight of the suspended forms, twisting slowly in the draft that swept across the yard. Calcraft reached up, hooking the blade into the hemp above Frederick's head. One cut. The body dropped into the coffin below with a dull, wooden thud that resonated through the scaffold structure. Thorne felt it in the soles of his shoes. A second cut for Marie. Another thud, lighter this time. The lids were slammed shut almost immediately, the nails driven home with hammers that rang like bells against the iron of the yard. Thorne opened the book again. His thumb smudged the previous entry, a black mark over the time of the drop. It did not matter. The truth was in the sequence, not the cleanliness of the page. He wrote life extinct. The words sat heavily on the line, final as the nails being driven below. He capped the inkwell, the click of the lid sounding disproportionately loud against the rising clamor. Down in the yard, the crowd pressed against the barriers. Men stood on shoulders. Women waved handkerchiefs dipped in vinegar to mask the smell, though there was little scent this morning save for the damp wool of the congregation and the iron tang of fear. They wanted pieces. A fragment of the rope was worth $1 in the pubs of Bermondsey. A lock of hair could buy a pint in Southwark. Thorne had seen it before, the commerce of death that flourished in the shadow of the gallows. He tucked the pen behind his ear and descended the remaining stairs, merging into the shadow of the structure. A turnkey brushed past him, carrying the hammers, his apron stained with oil and older things. He did not look at Thorne. Everyone here was part of the machine, cogs grinding against cogs, none permitted to acknowledge the friction. Outside the jail walls, the noise was different, less contained. The street beyond the gates was a river of hats and faces, flowing away from the site of the execution now that the spectacle had concluded. The urgency had drained from them, replaced by the sluggish satisfaction of a meal finished. Thorne pushed through the throng, his shoulder checking against a rough coat, his elbow deflecting a woman carrying a basket of watercress. She swore at him, a sharp curse lost in the general din. He did not apologize. His hand tightened on the book. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the grey brick of the surrounding buildings, but the sky remained low, pressing down on the chimneys. A cart rumbled past, the wheels iron-shod and loud on the cobbles, heading towards the anatomical theatre. Thorne watched it go. The Mannings would not go to the surgeons this time. The sentence had been burial within the precincts of the prison. A small mercy, perhaps, or merely an administrative decision to avoid the trouble of transport. He turned his collar up against the damp. The air tasted of coal smoke and horse manure, the ordinary stench of London returning to cover the extraordinary stench of the execution. He reached the corner of the street and paused. Behind him, the gates of Horsemonger Lane were closing. The turnkeys were retreating into the stone belly, locking the day's violence behind iron and wood. Thorne looked back one last time. Above the wall, the top of the scaffold was visible, stark against the sky. The ropes hung down now, loose and empty, swaying slightly in the wind. They looked like pendulums that had stopped ticking. He turned away. The ledger remained in his hand, heavy with the weight of 2 lives reduced to ink and paper. A boy ran past, shouting about the double drop and selling the news before the broadsheets were even printed. 2 at once, husband and wife, penny for the truth. Though Thorne ignored him, knowing the truth was not for sale on the corner, it remained locked in the book under his arm, and even there it was only a shadow of what had happened on the wood. He began to walk towards the Thames, towards the office where the files were kept. The city was waking properly now as shops opened their shutters. An omnibus clattered by, the horses steaming in the cold, while life resumed its rhythm, indifferent to the silence that had just been enacted behind the wall. Thorne's fingers were stiff. He flexed them, the joints cracking. He needed to wash the ink from his skin before he took the coach home. It lingered in the creases of his knuckles, a stain that soap would struggle to remove. He rubbed his thumb against his forefinger, trying to dislodge a spot of dried gall. It did not move. It would fade with time, like the memory of the drop, like the sound of the crowd. But not today. Today the ink felt permanent. He reached the wharf and waited for the boat, the water lapping against the pilings, black and oily. The tide was coming in. It would wash the shore clean eventually. Nothing else would. The ink had dried to a dull sheen on his thumbnail, a second skin that refused to be scrubbed away by the river's damp breath. Thorne stood at the edge of the wharf, watching the black water lap against the timber pilings with a rhythmic, sucking sound that mimicked the slow exhalation of a dying man. It was a vulgar noise, intimate and wet, stripping away the grandeur of the state's justice until only the mechanics of disposal remained. He shifted the ledger under his arm, the leather binding creaking in protest against the pressure of his grip, a small, dry complaint lost in the wider groan of the port. A barge drifted past, laden with sacks of coal that dusted the air with a fine grey powder, settling on the shoulders of his coat like ash from a funeral pyre. The bargeman did not look up, his pole driving into the mud with a steady, unthinking rhythm that suggested he had seen 100 hangings and cared for none. Perhaps he had. In London, death was merely another cargo, shuffled from the gallows to the grave with the same indifference as a shipment of turnips or iron. "Mind your step, governor," a voice rasped from the shadows of a warehouse door. Thorne started, his hand instinctively tightening on the book before he recognized the speaker as a dockhand sweeping the cobbles. The man leaned on his broom, his face streaked with soot, eyes bright with the curious hunger of those who live on the periphery of great events. He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the stones, the dark fluid spreading quickly in the damp air. "Fine morning for a swim, ain't it?" the dockhand said, jerking his chin towards the river. "Or for a walk home if you've got the fare." "The tide is high," Thorne replied, his voice sounding thin to his own ears, stripped of the authority he usually summoned in the courtrooms. "It will turn soon enough." "I turns every day, same as the hangman's drop," the man chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Heard it went smooth, 2 at once. Never seen that myself, but my cousin works the lane. Said they dropped like stones. No kicking, no fuss, just done." Thorne felt a sudden, sharp nausea twist in his gut, a physical rejection of the casual summary. He looked away, focusing on a seagull circling above the mast of a moored schooner, its cry harsh and demanding against the low sky. The bird dipped, snatching something invisible from the air before soaring higher, indifferent to the human drama below. "Efficiency is the aim of the procedure," Thorne said, the words tasting like dust. "It is not a spectacle for relation." "Sentence 1, isn't it though? Dialogue." "Sentence 2, the dockhand pushed off the wall, stepping closer into the light. Action." "Sentence 3, folks paid good money to stand on them roofs, bought tickets for the windows." Dialogue, currently 2 short sentences. "Sentence 4, my cousin said the lady didn't even flinch when the cap went on." Dialogue. Sentence 5, just stood there stiff as a poker. Dialogue, fragment short. Sentence 6, makes you wonder, don't it? Dialogue. "It is not for us to wonder," Thorne snapped, the sudden heat in his tone startling them both into silence. "It is for us to record, to ensure the law is kept rather than to dissect the soul." The dockhand held up his hands, palms open in a gesture of mock surrender. "No offense meant, mister, just passing the time. You clerks, you think you own the truth because you write it down. But the truth is out there, in the mud, in the water, not in your book." He turned back to his sweeping, the bristles scratching against the stone, a rhythmic counterpoint to the lapping water. Thorne stood frozen for a moment, the man's words echoing in the hollow space the execution had left behind. "Not in your book." The idea was heretical, dangerous, and yet it clung to him with the persistence of the ink stain on his skin. He looked down at the ledger, the dark cover seemingly absorbing the grey light of the morning. Inside, the entries were precise: time of drop, duration of suspension, confirmation of death. Facts, solid, unassailable facts. But as he traced the embossed title with his thumb, he felt the hollowness of them. They described the event, yes, but they did not contain it. They could not capture the silence that had fallen over the crowd, nor the specific, terrible weight of 2 bodies falling in unison. A whistle blew from further down the wharf, sharp and piercing, signaling the arrival of the packet boat. The sound shattered the moment, scattering the gulls and sending the dockhands scurrying to their tasks. Thorne stepped forward, raising a hand to signal the boatman, his movements stiff, mechanical. The vessel bumped against the pilings with a dull thud, ropes flying onto the quay before being secured with practiced knots. He climbed aboard, the wood of the deck vibrating slightly under his feet as the engine began to churn the water. The smell of oil and hot metal rose up, mixing with the river stench, a modern perfume that did little to mask the underlying rot. He found a seat near the stern, away from the other passengers who huddled in groups, talking loudly about the morning's entertainment. Their voices were bright, animated, stripped of the gravity that weighed upon him. They spoke of the crowd size, of the view from the rooftops, of the price of rope fragments. Thorne opened the ledger on highs, the pages fluttering in the breeze generated by the boat's movement. He took out his pen, the nib gleaming dully in the overcast light. There was a final entry to make, a notation of the transit of the record to the coroner's office. A formality, but his hand hovered over the page, the inkwell uncapped, the black liquid still and deep. The boat pulled away from the wharf, widening the gap between him and the shore, between the living city and the place where death had been administered. As he watched the wharf recede, the figure of the dockhand became smaller, just another smudge in the grey landscape. Behind the paddle wheel the water churned white, a turbulent trail that would soon vanish into the smooth, dark flow of the Thames. Thorne dipped the pen. When the nib touched the paper, he wrote the date, the time, the location. Then he paused. The boat rocked gently, a cradle for the living, while behind him the empty rope still swung in the wind at Horsemonger Lane, marking time for no one. He capped the pen, the click final, and closed the book. The water rushed on, indifferent to the ink and indifferent to the dead, carrying them all towards the sea. The scent of vinegar and old dust hung heavy in the air, a dry crust lining the back of the throat. Elias Thorne sat at the mahogany desk, the surface scarred by decades of nib scratches and ink spills, each mark a small testament to a life ended by the state. He pressed the binding press down with both hands, the iron screw groaning under the torque, until the calf skin spine settled tight against the boards. A final adjustment. He eased the pressure off, the mechanism sighing as it released its grip on the volume. "Will that be all, sir?" Thorne looked up. Gable stood in the doorway, a broom in hand, dustpan dangling from his wrist like a dead weight. The boy was young, too young for the gloom of this place, with eyes that darted towards the window whenever the street noise rose above the ticking of the clock. "For now," Thorne said, instructing them to leave the sand on the blotter, since he might need to dry another page. "Thought you'd finished the Manning ledger." As Gable stepped inside, the broom bristles scratched against the flagstones. He had seen the wagon come back from Horsemonger, its cage empty. "The record is complete. The physical book requires binding." Strange business, that one. Gable leaned the broom against the wall, wiping his hands on his trousers. "My brother stood on the roof of the butcher's shop, said the woman looked right at him when the trap went, right at him." Thorne picked up the volume. It was heavier than it should have been, dense with the weight of 2 executions compressed into fiber and glue. He ran a thumb over the title, embossed in gold leaf on the spine. November 1849. The letters caught the dim light from the gas jet, flickering as the pressure in the line shifted. "People see what they wish to see, Gable. The crowd wants a spectacle. The law requires only an entry." "Suppose so," the boy shrugged, picking up the broom again. "Just seems odd, 2 of them, together, doesn't happen often." "Really? Reckon it scares them more than a single rope." "It is not our place to reckon." Thorne opened the book again, though the work was done. He needed to see the last line, to ensure the ink had truly settled into the paper rather than sitting on top like oil on water. "You may go." Gable hesitated, then swept a pile of grit into his pan. "Night, Mr. Thorne." "Good night." The door clicked shut. The room returned to its private stillness, broken only by the distant rumble of a cart wheel over cobblestones and the persistent drip of a leak somewhere in the walls. Thorne traced the final entry with his finger. 13th November, 9 o'clock. Sentence carried out. The words were stark, devoid of the choking dust that had filled the air at Horsemonger Lane, devoid of the collective gasp that had risen from the thousands gathered to watch. Here, under the gaslight, it was merely administrative, clean. He reached for the inkwell, uncorking it with a sharp pop. The smell was acrid, sulphurous, biting the nose. He dipped the nib, watching the black liquid cling to the steel before he touched it to the index page. A single line to confirm the volume was closed. Register number 44, bound. The pen scratched, a dry friction that sounded louder than it should have in the empty room. He blew on the wet ink, the puff of air dispersing the sheen before it darkened to a permanent matte. This was the sanctity of the document. The state did not remember the face of the condemned, nor the sound of the drop, nor the way the body swung in the cold wind. It remembered the paper, If the paper burned, the death never happened. If the ink faded, the justice was undone. Thorne understood this transaction better than the judges or the hangmen. They dealt in flesh and rope. He dealt in the permanence of the archive. Yet the dockhand's words from the morning drifted back through the haze of the afternoon. Not in your book. He closed the ledger. The sound was dull, a finality that resonated in the bones of his wrists. He stood, the chair legs scraping against the floor with a harsh shriek that made him flinch. His joints stiffened from the cold, the damp of the river seeping into his coat despite the distance. He walked to the window, pressing his palm against the cold glass. Outside, the fog had returned, wrapping the street in a woolly grey shroud that swallowed the gas lamps whole. Shapes moved within it, shadows of men and horses, indistinct and ghostly. A newsboy shouted somewhere in the distance, the words muffled by the mist. Extra, extra, the Manning hanging. The voice rose and fell, a rhythmic chant that sold death for a halfpenny. Thorne turned away from the window. The office felt smaller now, the walls closing in as the light failed. He picked up his hat from the stand, the felt brim dusty. He brushed it with his sleeve, the motion automatic, meaningless. The ledger sat on the desk, a dark block in the gloom. He could leave it there. Gable would lock up, but the weight of it demanded personal custody, at least for tonight. He tucked the volume under his arm, the edge digging into his ribs. It felt like carrying a brick or a stone from a grave. He walked to the door, his boots heavy on the boards. The corridor outside was dark, the gas jets turned low to save coin. He navigated by memory, counting the steps to the main entrance. 3 paces, turn, 5 paces, stop. The lock tumbled with a heavy clunk when he turned the key. He pushed the door open, stepping out into the chill of the pavement. The air outside was thicker than inside, wet with the breath of the city. He pulled his collar up, shielding his neck from the damp. The fog clung to his whiskers, cooling the skin. He began to walk, the rhythm of his steps matching the distant tolling of a church bell. Somewhere to the east, the Thames flowed on, black and oily, carrying the refuse of the day towards the sea. The book under his arm was dry, safe, preserved. The river took everything else. He passed a constable standing on the corner, the man's lantern casting a weak circle of light on the wet stones. The officer nodded, a silent acknowledgement of one official to another. Thorne nodded back, not breaking stride. He did not look towards the river. He did not look back at the office. He kept his eyes on the path ahead, where the fog was thickest, where the shapes of the city dissolved into nothingness. The ledger pressed against his side, a constant reminder of the morning's work. It was done, the law was satisfied, the paper was filled, yet the hollowness remained, a gap in the chest where the breath should have been. He tightened his grip on the book, the edges biting deeper, and walked into the grey. The pavement slicked underfoot, a treacherous glaze of soot and spittle that demanded a careful, shuffling gait rather than a confident stride. Thorne kept to the edge, where the curb offered a sliver of dry stone, his shoulder brushing the rough brick of a warehouse that exhaled the sour tang of fermenting tea. The book beneath his arm felt heavier with every step, the leather cover absorbing the damp until it seemed to swell against his ribs, a living thing feeding on the moisture of the air. He passed a hansom cab, the horse steaming in the cold, its driver huddled deep within a collar of matted fur, eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond the fog. No one looked at him. No one ever looked at the clerk who carried the dead in a box of paper and glue. The newsboy's cry had faded, swallowed by the woolly thickness of the atmosphere, leaving only the rhythmic clop of hooves and the distant, mournful whistle of a river barge navigating the blind curves of the Thames. He turned towards the water, drawn by a gravity that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with the inevitable pull of the tide. The embankment here was crumbling, the stone flags displaced by the roots of weeds that thrived in the filth, jagged gaps waiting to snap an ankle. Thorne stopped at the railing, the iron cold enough to burn his palm through his glove, and leaned over to watch the black current slide beneath the arches of London Bridge. It moved with a sluggish, oily indifference, carrying scraps of wood, a dead rat bloated like a bladder, and the unseen refuse of a million households towards the sea. The river did not care for registers or indictments. It took the body of O'Connor, dissolved in quicklime and dumped in the dark, and it would take the Mannings soon enough, once the surgeons were done with their cutting and the state had no further use for the flesh. Water erased, paper preserved. A cruel arithmetic, yet the only one the Crown respected. A group of men stood further down, silhouettes against the grey, sharing a clay pipe and passing a bottle wrapped in brown paper. Their laughter floated up, harsh and brittle, stripped of any genuine mirth by the chilling air. One of them gestured towards the bridge, miming a hanging motion, jerking his chin up as if a rope had already tightened around his own throat. The others roared, slapping knees, finding comedy in the mechanics of death now that the spectacle was over and the blood had dried. Thorne tightened his grip on the ledger, the corners digging into his side, a sharp reminder of the weight he carried. He wanted to tell them that the joke was not in the drop, but in the ink that made it real, that without his hand, their amusement would be nothing more than a rumor lost in the mist. But words were cheap here, cheaper than the gin in the bottle, and he had spent his quota of speech for the day. He pushed away from the railing, the metal groaning under his weight, and turned his back on the water. The walk home would be long, the streets winding like intestines through the bloated belly of the city, but he could not yet return to the silence of his own rooms. There was a need, sudden and pressing, to set down one final truth that belonged to no registry, no judge, no crowd. He diverted from his usual path, heading instead towards the narrow alley where his lodgings waited, a cramped box above a chandler's shop that smelled perpetually of tallow and mice. The fog thickened as he moved inland, clinging to his coat, settling in the folds of his trousers, making him feel as though he were wading through a soup of grey milk. Gas lamps flickered overhead, their light struggling to penetrate the gloom, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to reach for his ankles. Inside the building, the stairs creaked under his boots, the wood warped by years of damp and neglect. He climbed slowly, the ledger still tucked under his arm, his breath coming in short, white puffs that vanished the moment they left his lips. On the landing, the air was stagnant, trapped between the walls, holding the scent of boiled cabbage and coal dust. He fumbled with the key at his door, the metal stiff with cold, before pushing it open and stepping into the small room that served as his sanctuary and his prison. A single candle burned on the desk, the flame dancing in the draught from the window, casting erratic shadows against the peeling wallpaper. He placed the ledger on the table, the thud echoing in the small space, and stripped off his coat, hanging it on the hook by the door with a care that bordered on the ritualistic. From the bottom drawer of the desk, he withdrew a smaller book, bound in plain calf, its pages unlined and blank save for the few entries he had made in secret over the past months. This was the Ledger of Bones, the true record that would never see the light of the coroner's office, never be filed away in the archives of the state. He sat, the chair groaning beneath him, and dipped a fresh quill into the inkwell, the nib scratching against the glass as he sought the right angle. The candlelight flickered, illuminating the dust motes that danced above the paper, tiny galaxies swirling in the stillness. He hesitated, the pen hovering over the page, the ink gathering at the tip like a drop of blood ready to fall. What could he write that would capture the silence, the way the crowd had held its breath, not in reverence, but in a voracious hunger that was satisfied only when the bodies stopped twitching? The roar was not in the throat of the mob, he wrote, the letters forming slowly, deliberately, each stroke a defiance of the official narrative. It was in the snapping of the wood, the groan of the beam, the terrible final silence that followed when the cheering died and there was nothing left but two shapes swinging in the wind. He paused, the ink drying on the page, the words staring back at him with an accusatory intensity. It was not enough. It would never be enough. But it was all he had, this private confession of a man who had seen too much and said too little. He added one more line, the pen pressing hard into the paper, leaving an indentation that would remain even if the ink was scraped away. I was there, I saw, I remember. He blew out the candle, the smoke curling upward in a thin grey ribbon that merged with the shadows of the room. Darkness rushed in, immediate and absolute, swallowing the desk, the book, the man. Thorne sat in the blackness, listening to the city breathe outside, the distant rumble of carts, the shout of a drunkard, the endless, indifferent flow of the river. The ledger on the desk was a heavy presence in the dark, a tombstone for the living and the dead alike. He closed his eyes, but the image remained, burned into the retina, the twin ropes, the drop, the stillness. It would not fade, it would never fade. He reached out in the dark, his fingers finding the edge of the private journal, closing it with a soft click that sounded like a coffin lid shutting. The room was silent now, truly silent, waiting for the morning to bring the noise, the light, the lies. He sat still, a ghost in his own life, guarding the truth in the dark. The smoke from the extinguished wick did not vanish, but hung suspended, a grey ghost twisting in the air before dissipating into the cold corners of the room where the shadows waited like old friends. Thorne remained seated, his spine rigid against the chair back, feeling the damp chill of the November night seep through his waistcoat and settle deep in the marrow of his bones. Outside, the city refused to sleep, continuing its relentless, grinding rhythm with the indifference of a machine that had no use for the conscience of a single clerk. A cart rumbled past on the cobbles below, the iron rims striking sparks against the stone, a harsh metallic clatter that sounded too much like the trapdoor springing open. He flinched, a small, involuntary twitch of the shoulder, though no one was there to witness the betrayal of his nerves. The darkness pressed against his eyelids, heavy and absolute, yet behind them the image of the two bodies swinging in tandem played on a loop, vivid and terrible in its clarity. Marie's bonnet had slipped during the drop, exposing the nape of her neck, pale and vulnerable against the black wool of her dress, while Frederick had kicked out once, a final, futile struggle against the inevitability of the hemp. These details belonged to him alone, locked away in the skull where the official record could not reach them, safe from the sanitizing brush of the coroner's pen. He shifted in the chair, the wood groaning under his weight, a sound that seemed disproportionately loud in the stillness of the tiny room. His hand found the edge of the desk, fingers tracing the grain of the wood, seeking something solid to anchor himself against the vertigo of memory. The inkwell sat cold beside the journal, the liquid inside frozen into a solid, useless mass that mirrored the state of his own thoughts. There was no more writing to be done tonight, no more truths to capture in the net of language, for some things resisted the ink, slipping through the mesh of words like water through a clenched fist. He thought of the ledger upstairs in the office, the heavy leather-bound volume that would sit on a shelf in Whitehall, gathering dust, while the names inside turned to dry bones in the pauper's pit. That book was a lie, or at least a half-truth, a polished stone thrown into a deep well to mark a depth it could never truly measure. This small calf-bound journal in the dark was the only thing that held the weight of the actual event, the smell of the crowd, the way the light had failed just as the drop fell. A shiver ran through him, starting at the base of his skull and racing down the length of his spine, forcing him to wrap his arms around his own torso in a futile attempt to generate warmth. The silence of the room was not empty but full, crowded with the echoes of the day, the shouted prayers, the jeers of the boys who had climbed the walls for a better view. He remembered a woman near the front, her face upturned, mouth open in a silent scream of delight that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with bloodlust. She had worn a shawl of bright red wool, a splash of color in the monochrome gloom, and he wondered if she was still out there, walking the streets, carrying that memory like a secret jewel. The thought made his stomach turn, a slow, churning motion that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with the sour taste of complicity. He had watched, he had written, he had done nothing to stop the machinery, only to document its efficiency. The candle stump on the desk was cold now, a blackened nub surrounded by a pool of hardened tallow that looked like spilled fat from a butcher's slab. He reached out and touched it, the wax brittle under his fingertip, crumbling into small white flakes that drifted onto the page of the open journal. Let it stay. Let the mark remain as a testament to the impermanence of all this recording, this desperate scratching against the void. Tomorrow the sun would rise, grey and watery behind the fog, and the clerks would return to their desks, dipping their quills in fresh ink to record the crimes of the new day. The Mannings would become a footnote, a cautionary tale told over gin in the public houses of Bermondsey, their names slowly eroding until only the location of the house remained, Minster Yard. The words would lose their power, becoming just another street name on a map, devoid of the horror that had soaked into the floorboards. But tonight, in this room, the horror was fresh, breathing down his neck, waiting for him to acknowledge its presence. Thorne stood up, his joints stiff, the blood rushing back into his legs with a prickling sensation that made him stumble slightly against the table. He moved to the window, pressing his forehead against the cold glass, looking out at the street below where a lone figure walked under the flickering gas lamp, hat pulled low against the damp. The fog had thickened again, swirling around the man's legs, obscuring his feet so that he seemed to float above the pavement, a spectre drifting through the city of the dead. How many of them were ghosts already, walking around with breath in their lungs, but hollowed out by the things they had seen. He turned away from the window, unable to bear the sight of the living moving so casually through the graveyard London had become. The bed in the corner was unmade, the sheets rumpled from a night of fitful sleep days ago, calling to him with a promise of oblivion he knew he could not accept. Sleep would bring dreams, and dreams would bring the ropes, the drop, the terrible, synchronized jerk that had ended 2 lives with the precision of a clockmaker's tool. Better to sit in the dark. Better to keep vigil with the truth while the city lied to itself about the nature of justice. He moved back to the chair, lowering himself down with a slow, deliberate care, as if any sudden movement might shatter the fragile silence holding the room together. His hand rested on the closed journal, feeling the texture of the calf's skin, rough and warm from the heat of his own palm. It was a small thing, this book. Insignificant against the weight of the law, the might of the crown, the roar of the thousands who had gathered to witness the end. Yet it was his, the only thing in this entire wretched business that belonged solely to him, unedited, uncensored, unapproved by the governor or the judge. A noise from the street below caught his attention, the sharp bark of a dog, followed by the clatter of hooves as a carriage rushed past, wheels splashing through the mud. Sound faded quickly, swallowed by the fog, leaving the silence to rush back in, heavier than before. Thorne closed his eyes, listening to the rhythm of his own breathing, shallow and quick, a stark contrast to the slow, deep sleep of the dead beneath the floor of the execution shed. They were gone now, reduced to matter, to weight, to silence. And he was here, alive, burdened with the memory of their passing, tasked with carrying the echo of their final moments until his own time came to face the drop or the grave. The cold had settled deep in his chest now, a permanent fixture, a block of ice that no amount of coal or blankets could ever fully melt. He sat still, a statue in the dark, guarding the book, guarding the truth, waiting for a morning that felt impossibly far away. The city groaned outside, a living beast shifting in its sleep, unaware of the man sitting in the tiny room above the chandler, keeping watch over the dead. Time stretched, elastic and strange, the minutes dragging out into hours, each second a lifetime spent in the company of ghosts. He did not move, he did not speak. He simply existed, a witness in the dark, holding the line between what happened and what would be written. The fog pressed against the window, a silent demand for entry, but the glass held firm, separating the inside from the outside, the truth from the lie. Thorne breathed in, the air tasting of dust and old paper, and waited for the dawn. The Rope and the Roar is a work of fiction. Its characters and scenes are invented, but the story is grounded in real events, places, and the social conditions of its period, dramatized, not documented. The history behind it draws on these real sources. Marie Manning, murderess. Timeline of London, 19th century. Researched via Wikipedia and contemporary records. Liberties taken with the timeline or with real persons are the author's own.